Chapter 1860. The old man retracted his gaze and suddenly slammed the table. I'm just a Jianghu brute. I don't care about the matters of the battlefield. Brother Su, we're family now. To put it bluntly, please don't take it to heart. Along the way, I've looked down on the fish dragon gang in Beiliang. What do you mean by one of the top 10 gangs? You're just like a nest of snakes and rats. I don't understand. Just like the southern border dragon palace, which was given to Nailan Yusi by the king of Yen, how good is the fish dragon gang in Mount Qingliang? It's nothing more than the second tide listening lake of that young King Su. 20 to 30,000 gang members. What's the difference between them and the 10,000-tailed carp in Mount Qingliang? Of course, the drum platform in Gangnam-do is the same. It's said that it was created by the eldest grandson of the Pillar State, Yu Jiankong. Who knows if the otherworldly Lu Han Xian is the lover of some great eunuch's son. The old man lowered his head and looked at the wine in his cup. He was somewhat sentimental. Even if it's the Donghua Sword Pool, a sect with hundreds of years of history, why did Song Nianqing die? Why did Chai Ching Shan appear on the city walls of Great Peace City? Brother Su, you're still young, unlike me who's lived for so long. There are many things that you probably don't understand. When Wang Xianji was overseeing Martial Emperor City, or rather the entire Jianghu, the Jianghu wasn't like this back then. Even Mount Longhu, which had the closest relationship with the imperial court in the early years, was like a king of the mountain. They could look down on dukes and marquises. Not to mention, the two Zen temples had a white-clothed monk who was personally received by the old Emperor Liang. The old man kept muttering, the Jianghu wasn't like this back then. In the end, he drank half a cup of wine. He looked at Su Fengnian blankly and said bitterly, how could Wang Xianji lose to that young King Su? How could he die? Wang Xianji shouldn't have died, and he can't die. With his death, the Jianghu changed. Su Fengnian had suspected that the old man with the surname Tong had recognized him, but that was quickly denied. Words, expressions, and even eyes could be concealed seamlessly. However, as long as a martial artist had not reached the realm of Earth Immortal, Su Fengnian would be able to see everything clearly. On the other hand, Su Fengnian had deliberately concealed his aura. Even a celestial phenomenon expert might not be able to detect his presence. The old man sighed heavily and grinned. After all, I'm an experienced man. I know Brother Su's identity is not simple. Otherwise, I wouldn't have dared to hang a Beiliang saber in public. If I'm not wrong, Brother Su, you're from one of the largest families in Liangzhou, right? Su Fengnian nodded and said with a smile, indeed. The old man chuckled and said, that's not a problem. Let's drink. There's no more wine on the table. Why don't I buy you another bottle? Su Fengnian immediately waved his hand and called for the waiter to order 2 more bottles of green and wine. The waiter turned around and rolled his eyes, then went to get the wine resentfully. Damn it. You poor old man and young woman. You only ordered a few dishes that cost money, but you're addicted to the green and wine that doesn't cost money. Unknowingly, this pair of brothers who sat at the same table and called each other brothers had already drunk 5 bottles of green and wine. Green and wine was known as a strong wine that could burn the throat and break the intestines. Therefore, the young woman reminded softly, Grandpa, it's about time. The after effect of this wine is not small. The old man's vision was cloudy. He swayed and said cheerfully, it's rare for Grandpa to drink to his heart's content. You've never drunk before, so you don't know that wine is the coolest medicine in the world. Otherwise, why would the ancients say that fame and fortune are thicker than wine, making people drunk and unable to wake up? Then, the old man clinked his cup with Su Fengnian's and gulped down another big mouthful. Previously, the old man raised his cup and swayed it back and forth. Su Fengnian finally clinked his cup with the old man's. However, the old man's speech was much clearer than when he drank the second bottle of wine. He probably woke up from his drunken stupor. The old man revealed a meaningful smile and raised his eyebrows at Su Fengnian. It was the first time he used the title of young Master Su. He asked, "What do you think of my granddaughter?" Su Fengnian was speechless. Was he trying to matchmake Su Ke? It seemed that the old man had really woken up from his drunken stupor. The young woman took a deep breath, then held her breath and focused her mind. The old man sighed and said, "Don't be nervous. I'm old and my eyesight is not bad. Although you'll be a good match for many women in the world, unfortunately, you're not the kind of man my granddaughter will like." The old man's eyes became brighter and brighter. He twisted the wine cup with 2 fingers and said to himself, "When I was young like you, I liked to wander the Jianghu. So, I was lucky enough to meet many old guys. Some of them were like dragons, such as sword god Li Chungang, Fengdu's green robe, spring man Lu Yingong, and so on. I also met many small figures in the Jianghu. Now, even I can't remember their names. But anyway, the Jianghu people at that time believed in the old rules that are regarded as pedantic and ridiculous by modern people. They were willing to honor their promises and were willing to disregard life and death. So, I don't like the fish dragon gang in Beiliang, nor do I like the current Liang Lake. The current Jianghu is a pool of stagnant water under the steps of the temple. No matter how many immortals there are on earth, it's still boring. After all, the Jianghu people want to wander the Jianghu, not watch and listen to the Jianghu." Speaking of this, the old man looked at his granddaughter with kind eyes. "But it's good that she likes it." The old man smiled. "If you want to talk about what I dislike the most, it's still the Su family in Beiliang." Su Fengnian's expression was as usual. He lowered his head and took a sip of wine. The old man who spoke without thinking said sadly, 20 years ago, Liang Lake didn't dare to talk about strength of character in front of the Su family's iron horse. They were trampled inch by the Su family's horses. Now, that butcher finally went to see the king of hell, but Liang Lake still doesn't dare to call itself a master in front of the Su family. This Jianghu seems to be regressing. Back then, Butcher Su Shao relied on his invincible iron horse to dominate the Jianghu. But now, Su Shao's eldest son alone is enough to make the whole Jianghu suffer. Su Fengnian raised his wine cup. "Brother, come, let me toast you." The old man who had originally planned to stop drinking hesitated for a moment, but still poured a full cup of green and wine. He asked with a smile, "Why?" "Brother, your surname is Su. Are you related to the Beiliang Palace in Mount Qingliang?" Su Fengnian narrowed his eyes and smiled. "Because it's free to drink green and wine in this restaurant." The old man's mouth twitched. "What? It doesn't cost money to drink." Su Fengnian nodded. "The food is extremely expensive, and it can't be less than a copper coin. Only the green and wine doesn't cost a copper coin." The young woman held back her laughter. The old man was dumbfounded. He suddenly came back to his senses and shouted, "Waiter, bring 2 more pots of green and wine." Su Fengnian held back his laughter. "Brother Tong, I really can't drink anymore." The old man glared at him and said angrily, "Brat, don't call me Brother Tong. Call me Uncle Tong." Suddenly, the young woman reached out and pressed the hilt of a saber. She said in a low voice, "Upstairs, there's a murderous aura." Su Fengnian's expression became strange. The young woman thought that this young master from Liangzhou had an ordinary aura and didn't take her words seriously. Considering that he had accompanied her grandfather to drink so many pots of green and wine, she reminded him for the first time. "Young Master Su, there are many masters on the 3rd floor. At least 4 or 5 of them have strong and majestic qis. If these masters, who are strong enough to reach the 1st grade, fight, I may not be able to take care of you." Su Fengnian knew the situation upstairs. Qing Baishuang, the #1 master in Nanjiang, Mao Shulang, the saber master, and Ji Lu and the chief visiting officer of the Dragon Palace. Wei Miao, the #1 master in Nanzhao, and Xue Songguan, the blind zither player. There were already 5 of them. Su Fengnian's expression was strange because the young woman's words about murderous aura reminded him of 2 catchphrases he had said countless times. There's murderous aura in my crotch. My crotch is very depressed. Every time 2 fledgling Jianghu wanderers took off their pants and peed together, they would compete to see who had more murderous aura. In the dead of night, when he was tossing and turning, or when he woke up in the morning, he would look down at his crotch and say, "Brother, I'm so sorry. I'm such a useless big brother. Bear with it." She still remembered back then when that fellow cooperated with her as a fortune teller to cheat people of their money. There was one time when he threw a stick of bad luck into the pot behind her back. In the end, it was picked by a young lady who was led by an elder to draw lots for marriage. The result could be imagined. But at that time, that young lady's appearance was really shocking. Su Fengnian subconsciously looked out the window. Even he didn't realize that the corners of his mouth were curled up and he was smiling warmly. By the time Su Fengnian came back to his senses, a loud bang was heard from the 3rd floor. Su Fengnian stood up. "Uncle Tong, Miss Tong, my friend is on the 3rd floor. I have to go take a look." He had long guessed the woman's identity. She was Tong Shanquan, the head of Jinsua Saber Manor in Nanzhao. She was a genuine female saber master. Her martial arts path was exactly the same as Linya, the fist master of Martial Emperor City. Then she had 2 blades on her right waist. They were the 6th and 9th most important weapons in the world. Martial virtue and heavenly treasure. The old man's expression was serious. "Since that's the case, let my granddaughter accompany you." Su Fengnian shook his head and smiled. "I appreciate Uncle Tong's kindness. Don't worry, I know what's important." The old man was about to speak when he suddenly felt his granddaughter tug at his sleeve. He looked down and she shook her head. Although the old man didn't know what was going on, he still said worriedly, "You must be careful. If something's wrong, call out." Strangers meeting by chance could take life and death lightly. Perhaps this was the Jianghu of the old man's generation. Su Fengnian had just taken 2 steps when he suddenly turned around and gave a fist salute. He smiled and said, "The last cup of wine is for my father to toast Mr. Tong. If he can hear it with his own ears, not to mention 5 bottles of green ant wine, even 10 or 20 bottles, he will drink with Mr. Tong to his heart's content." After Su Fengnian left, the old man was confused and asked in confusion, "Little girl, what did Grandpa say just now?" She said in all seriousness, "I forgot." The old man, who was still a little dizzy, shook his head and decided not to think about it. He smiled and said, "Little girl, Grandpa has figured it out." She was a little curious. The old man said seriously, "This young man is not simple." The woman, who was known as the twin prides of Jianghu with the young banished immortal of Taibai sword sect, took a deep breath and pursed her lips tightly without saying a word. Just as she was feeling disappointed, the old man said something shocking. "He is the king of Beiliang, Su Fengnian." She was horrified. The old man lowered his head and took a sip, chuckling. "Silly girl, you believe this?" Chapter 1861. The death of the envoy of the royal family in the territory of the vassal prince was both a conspiracy and an overt one. The 3 eunuchs of the Directorate of Credentials were well aware of this. However, the decisiveness of the assassin was beyond their imagination. The final location of the assassination was Bay and Town, which was very close to Liangzhou City. This choice was too rash. However, it was precisely this almost unreasonable stupidity that brought the assassin a glimmer of hope. As Commander Qian of the palace guards expected, the assassin who attacked first was the man and woman at the table opposite the head eunuch Liu. 20 steps, 2 screens. When a figure used a sharp weapon to break the first screen in an instant, Commander Qian, who had been prepared, had already stood up and pulled out the golden knife that symbolized his identity from his waist. When the assassin cut the second screen in a straight line, Commander Qian did not blindly retreat and take a passive defensive position. Instead, he did not advance and instead retreated, quickly chopping at the assassin with his knife. His moves were simple, but his momentum was majestic. When he swung his knife, he was worthy of the nickname of Zanmadeo in the capital. Commander Qian's knife technique abandoned all forms and was not sloppy at all. It did not rely on the finesse of his moves. It already contained a sense of returning to simplicity. The world's knives and swords were similar, but there was also a competition of techniques. For example, Li Chungang, who was known to be on par with ancestor Liu in swordsmanship, and Dong Tai, who was at the peak of killing. Another example was Yu Groom and Lu Huang, who were also disciples of Wang Xianji in Wu City. They respectively pointed out 2 paths to the peak of swordsmanship. As for the masters of the knife technique, there was Mao Shulang, who was known to know all the knife techniques in the world, and Gu Jiantang, who surpassed him with only 2 moves. Commander Qian, who was far away from the battlefields of Jianghu and had lived in the Forbidden Palace for a long time, was obviously chasing after Gu Jiantang's shadow on the path of the knife technique. He pursued to use the fastest knife to kill in the shortest distance. This kind of suspicion of shallow martial virtue was the most common in the battlefields, but it was extremely rare in Jianghu where people understood each other well. Today, the spear saint of Snow Hut, Li Hozhao, who was one of the 4 sages of Liang Lake, was famous for not conceding in martial arts competition, not showing mercy when using his spear, and not letting people live after gaining the upper hand. Under the famous spear, Great Snow All, few people survived. Therefore, he was also called the 3UNS. Although his combat power was at the top of the 4 sages, his ranking in Jianghu was at the bottom, which caused the entire Snow Hut to not even be considered as a quasi-first-class sect. The music saint of Black Drum Platform even said that Li Hozhao's martial arts were too great, but his martial virtue was too little. Although they were both 4 sages, they were ashamed to be in the same group. Sure enough, Commander Qian killed the enemy with a single strike. If the previous assassin was said to have split the screen in half with a single strike, then Commander Qian was said to have split the assassin and his weapon in half with a single strike. Commander Qian was completely indifferent to the horrifying knife wound on his shoulder. He quickly exhaled and replaced it with fresh air. Normally, if Commander Qian wanted to fight to the death with this powerful assassin, even if he was destined to have the upper hand, he would not have succeeded in killing him with 1 strike. However, Commander Qian did not leave any leeway. He did not hesitate to be injured in exchange for a life, which was a stark contrast to the assassin who had deliberately stored up his strength for a last resort. This created a great situation where Commander Qian was only lightly injured and did not have any combat power. In a battle between Jianghu masters, there was a world of difference between fighting for victory and fighting for life and death. It seemed that Commander Qian, who was no stranger to the battlefields of Jianghu, understood this principle, but the assassin who had never fought on the battlefield did not. Behind Commander Qian, the head eunuch Lu did not move and continued to raise his cup and drink. The head eunuch Song pressed his hands on the edge of the chair. The white fat on his cheeks trembled and his lips were blue, as if he was mumbling something. Eunuch Ma, who was as tall and sturdy as a man outside the Great Pass, had already put down his chopsticks and stood when Commander Qian attacked. He walked steadily to Eunuch Lu's side. This hidden eunuch Qian did not show any joy when he saw Commander Qian cut the body in half. On the contrary, he quickly warned, "Be careful." After noticing the abnormality on the 3rd floor of the restaurant, Commander Qian, who was always walking on thin ice, naturally would not lower his guard. In reality, he was waiting for the assassin's true move. Even that seemingly hurried breath was a feint to lure the snake out of its hole. So when the gloomy woman who had left a deep impression on him arrived at almost the same time the man's body was cut in half, she could be said to have come straight from the two halves of the body. This scene was indescribably strange and bloody. Commander Qian opened the door to welcome the guest, at least 70 to 80% faster than she had imagined. It was still a heavy chop that could cut through a mountain. The woman did not use her sword to block the momentum of the chop at all. The tip of her sword still went straight for Commander Qian's heart. Her eyes were cold, and the slender arm that held the 3-foot-long sword did not tremble in the slightest. She was so calm when she killed, and she was so even when she was killed. This was probably a true top assassin. Even if Commander Qian had tilted his body slightly at the last moment and avoided the fatal blow, the green tip of the sword still cut a bloody groove in his chest. As for the vicious and merciless female assassin, she had already died under Commander Qian's second strike. Although the force of the blade didn't chop her body into pieces like before, it still knocked her body flying out, causing the table to collapse and explode into pieces, causing the ground to be in a mess. Her body fell into a pool of blood, and a shocking scarlet line of blood slowly appeared from between her eyebrows to her abdomen. Near her head, it happened to be where a wine jar had fallen. The wine slowly spread on the ground in silence. There was wine in death. From beginning to end, from life to death, she and her companions had not said a word. This kind of silence was far more intimidating than the murderous fighting. Chapter 1862. It was said that the Deer Reaping Tower that had gradually surfaced was regarded as the 11th sect in the world by the Wulin. It specialized in cultivating assassins who treated killing like dirt. They took money to eliminate disasters for others. No matter the identity of the person they killed, whether it was a high official or a top master who had already made a name for himself in the Jianghu, as long as the price was right, the Deer Reaping Tower would take the job. Even if the assassins died and suffered heavy losses, the Deer Reaping Tower would only continue to send a second and third batch. They would not stop until they reached their goal. After killing someone, they would cut off the head to show the reputation of the Deer Reaping Tower to their employer. It was widely rumored in the Jianghu that when Su Fengnian was still His Royal Highness, the assassins who killed Wang Mingyin for him outside Xiangfan City and the men of sacrifice who later killed the Celestial Realm Grandmaster Lu Haoshi all came from the most mysterious 9th tower of the Deer Reaping Tower. However, as for the truth, after Su Fengnian ascended to the top of the Jianghu, it became an unsolved case. The Deer Reaping Tower shrouded in fog would not give an answer, and no one dared to ask in front of the young king. After killing the two assassins that were very likely to have come from the Deer Reaping Tower, Commander Qian's face was pale. He quickly raised his trembling left hand and tapped a few major acupuncture points in front of his chest, causing the qi and blood that had been flowing normally in his meridians to immediately take a different path. He had to turn the blood groove near his wound into a place of death without help because the tip of the female man of sacrifice's sword was coated with poison. Once it seeped into his bone marrow, even an immortal on earth would not be able to save him. However, in this way, his life was not in danger for the time being. Commander Qian also lost the ability to continue fighting. He was afraid that the assassins still had people lurking in the shadows, so he quickly turned his head and said in a low voice, "3 eunuchs, we have to leave this place." In reality, from the first assassin splitting open the screen to Commander Qian speaking, it had only been a few blinks of an eye. At this moment, an angry roar came from outside the screen to Eunuch Lu's right. An ancient voice sounded above the heads of the 3 eunuchs of the Directorate of Credentials and Commander Qian. There was endless joy in the voice. Castrated dogs of Great Peace City. You came to Bailiang's territory to show off, and now you want to leave. Eunuch Song, whose bloated body was squeezed into the yellow rosewood chair, was pushed back along with the chair. It was clear that this great eunuch of the Directorate of Credentials was terrified. Eunuch Ma, who looked extremely heroic without his red python robe, had somehow circled to Eunuch Lu's right side. He raised his head and looked at the man and sword flying down. The burly eunuch had one hand behind his back and the other clenched into a fist on his abdomen. He sneered softly, "I'm waiting for you traitors." Eunuch Liu, who was sitting as steadily as Mount Tai, glanced at the old man with a head full of frost and snow. He sighed softly and drank the cup of green ant wine in his hand. The remaining people at the table behind the screen on the right all followed the white-haired swordsman, who was the most senior of them all, and flew towards the three eunuchs from the capital. For a moment, the screen seemed to be filled with butterflies and bees. It was a beautiful sight. In this group, other than a few who had taken down their weapons and placed them on the table, the others didn't get up to retrieve their weapons from the wooden racks. This was also why Commander Qian didn't immediately inform the three eunuchs. In Commander Qian's eyes, these 9 people had been chatting merrily about Xianyuanzi on the Great Snow Plains and comprehending immortality through observing snow for one night. Of the 4 young grandmasters, banished Immortal of the Tai-Bai Sword sect was the most likely to become the leader in the future. They were just ordinary people who wandered the Jianghu, and they racked their brains to gather together wherever they could accumulate prestige for their faction. They tried to curry favor with famous Jianghu figures, exchanged pointers with fellow Jianghu cultivators, and became sworn brothers with those who shared similar ideals. Commander Qian, who had once relied on an iron blade to conquer the world, had seen too many of these Jianghu figures more than 10 years ago. Compared to the 2 true men of sacrifice, this kind of trash couldn't be measured. However, Commander Qian felt a strong sense of unease in his heart for no reason. He subconsciously tightened his grip on the blade in his hand and turned his head to look at those Jianghu experts who, logically speaking, should have reached a higher level of Jianghu, but definitely couldn't be counted as assassins. The old swordsman, who had pounced down with the momentum of a lion hunting a rabbit, suddenly saw a blur in front of his eyes. Then, this old man, who had always been extremely confident in his swordsmanship, felt as if a sledgehammer had struck a bell in his chest. He came quickly and left even faster. Before he landed on the ground, he was already a corpse with blood flowing out of his 7 orifices. The old man's corpse that flew out collided with a young woman in white fluttering behind him. After flipping over the screen, they both fell onto the table together. Then, the table full of dishes and bowls slid to the ground. It was unknown whether the woman was dead or alive. Commander Qian suddenly shouted sternly, "Be careful below the screen." As it turned out, there were 9 people at the table, but only 8 assassins had leaped over the screen. The missing person was destined to be the trump card at the bottom of the box. First, they threw out bait as a smokescreen at the cost of 2 lives. Then, they pretended to be weak, and finally, they coincided with each other. This kind of calculated assassination was meticulous and sinister. One after another, it was impossible to guard against. Commander Qian had already seen through the killing intent after realizing that something was wrong. That eunuch Ma's reaction was not slow either. However, that 9th person who seemed to leisurely walk out from behind the screen could be said to come and go like a ghost. His move was earth-shattering. With just a tap of his foot, his body rushed forward as fast as rolling thunder. His 2 hands moved forward, and 2 short swords were hidden in his sleeves. Because his body rushed forward so quickly, the sword chi of the short swords, which were less than 5 inches long, seemed to leave behind 2 slender but resplendent white rainbows in the air. Fortunately, Eunuch Ma heard Commander Qian's warning and took a step back. The 2 hidden swords did not pierce his chest on the spot. Even so, his chest was still pierced with 2 bloody holes. Eunuch Ma, who was so angry that he laughed, opened his eyes wide. Although he was seriously injured, his vigorous aura did not drop in the slightest. His 5 fingers were like hooks, grabbing the assassin's head. With a casual swing, he threw the corpse, which had 5 nails nailed into the head, against the wall. When the hidden sword assassin died, he sat on the ground with his back against the wall. There was a smile at the corner of his mouth. He seemed to have already seen the glory of the final battle. Chapter 1863. Eunuch Ma felt helpless. Like Commander Qian, he had to flick his finger to open his acupuncture point. There was poison in the hidden blade. It did not appear to be fatal at the moment, but based on the craziness of these people, it was probably fatal. It was just a matter of time. Even if Bayan Town's Green Horse Relay and the Jingdo Cavalry flattened this restaurant, what benefit would it bring to the situation? This game of chess on the third floor of the restaurant could possibly affect the general trend of the entire world. The front and right-hand screens of the head eunuch Lu were no longer there. Then the remaining screen appeared particularly out of place. Eunuch Song stealthily stood up with his hand on the edge of the chair. This seemed very reasonable. In a situation like this where his clothes were of no use, it was normal for him to run away. At this time, Eunuch Lu's brow furrowed. For the first time tonight, he completely put down his wine cup and turned his head. A dark voice sounded by the ears of the three major eunuchs. You dare to wantonly gather people and kill people on the streets of Bailiang. Do you think the fish dragons do not exist? The owner of the voice quickly showed his true appearance. The screen was cut in half. It had been cut in half by his hand. Lu Nerong didn't stop her trusted subordinate from interfering in that inexplicable disturbance without permission. While she did not know the beginning and end of this assassination, the phrase, Jingdo eunuchs, had made her realize that this matter was unusual. In these years, as the head of the fish dragons on the surface, she had interacted with the various governments of Bailiang. She knew that Great Peace City had mustered a large force to enter Liangzhou to announce the edict. No matter what the attitude of the Wangfu and Mount Qingliang, the special identity of the eunuchs in the procession delivering the edict could not be publicly killed. Otherwise, not to mention the young emperor of Liang who had already given in to the 300,000 Bailiang cavalry, he would definitely be furious. The world would also question the motives of the Su family in Bailiang. As the head of the fish dragon gang on the surface, Lu Nerong had interacted with the various local authorities over the years. Although she never got tired of it, her horizons were no longer the same as a woman from a few years ago. As the head of the Jianghu in northern Liang, no matter how powerful the fish dragon gang was, it was still a flood dragon that flopped about in the lake that was northern Liang Path. Even if it didn't bow its head and be loyal and devoted to the prince's mansion on Mount Qingliang, at this sensitive time, there was absolutely no reason for it to stay out of this matter when faced with a murderous situation that was just a few steps away. Therefore, Lu Nerong would not stop the consecrator from taking action. She even knew that in this complicated and obscure situation, she had to cut the Gordian knot. Sitting at the same table with Lu Nerong was the chief visiting official of Dragon Palace, Ji Luhan. As a powerful Wu Dao grandmaster, he could see that the eunuchs of Great Peace City were at their wits' end. Even if the remaining 5 assassins were not worth mentioning in his eyes, they might be lucky enough to succeed in this chaotic situation. After getting the nod of Palace Master Lin Hongyuan, Ji Luhan smiled slightly and waved his hand. 5 white porcelain wine cups on the table flew in front of him and kept spinning. Between the wine cups full of spiritual qi, the soft knocking sounds were exceptionally crisp and pleasant, like 5 little white sparrows chirping. The wine cups flashed and disappeared. The next moment, before the 5 assassins could get close to Eunuch Ma and Commander Qian, their heads all swayed backward and they fell to the ground. The foreheads of the 5 pitiful creatures were all red without exception. Without the screen blocking their view, Eunuch Ma and Commander Qian could see the 5 wine cups. After returning to the table, they shook slightly, as if they were asking for credit. Eunuch Ma narrowed his eyes and remained calm. Commander Qian held the golden saber in his hand and turned to Ji Luhan to thank him. This bloody storm, which should have ended here, became particularly moving because of a certain someone's hidden action. Lu Nerong's face was aghast. Even Lin Hongyuan, who had been happily watching from the sidelines, was slightly stunned. His handsome face had some annoyance and shame from playing with fire, and there was uneasiness hidden in the depths of his limpid eyes. Qing Baishuang, the first master of southern border who looked like an old Confucian scholar, frowned and there was clear anger between his brows. This old man had been thinking about a major event that involved the fate of the country, so he was absent-minded for a moment. It turned out that no one had thought that the servant of the fish dragon gang who went to rescue would actually slap the head of the fat eunuch who had just stood up trembling with fear. With this palm strike, he could easily cut through the screen as if he was cutting tofu. Wouldn't he be able to easily smash the entire head into smithereens? Mao Shulang, who had been drinking with his head lowered, had actually held the hilt of his saber, but he suddenly released his fingers. Mao Shulang gave up midway and Qing Baishuang was caught off guard. The two Grand Masters of Southern Border didn't make a move, so it was reasonable to say that this slap would definitely cause blood to splash. However, the mad servant of the Fish Dragon gang did slap the head, but he didn't succeed. Because his arm was broken. Therefore, the broken arm that fell on the head of Eunuch Song was like a family elder patting the head of a younger generation intimately. Behind a screen in the distance, on the table in front of a blind female zither player, there was a simple and unadorned scorched-tail guqin. Her little finger was bent. Purely based on her deep understanding of the Xian finger realm, she was firmly in the top 3 in the world. Not convinced. However, this was the conclusion of a certain Grandmaster of Martial Arts evaluation. Chapter 1864. The top 3 were Dong Tai, who had long become an Earth Immortal, Cat Han Xingxian, who was good at killing celestial phenomena with his fingers, and the blind woman who was unknown in the Central Plains. She was the female guqin player who came to Western Shu from Beimang, Shui Songwan. Eunuch Lu cast a glance at his colleague, who had just escaped from the gates of hell but still had a confused look on his face. Under the eunuch's long stare, Eunuch Lu finally put away that comical expression of a layman in the world of martial arts. He chuckled, and his expression was gloomy and conceited. It was not until this moment that Eunuch Ma realized that his comical colleague was actually a martial arts master whose cultivation was not lower than his. Tonight, the mantis stalks the cicada, unaware of the oriole behind, and all kinds of slingshots that had been shot and not shot. Was there an end to it? Eunuch Ma had mixed feelings. A ghostly wailing voice suddenly rang out, this. What the hell is going on? In the aisle between the left and right private rooms, a middle-aged man in bright clothes looked as if he had lost his parents. Why are so many people dead? How can our restaurant continue to do business? Then, when he saw the frosty expression on Lu Narong's face, it was as if his parents had died, followed by his son. His face was full of despair. Head shopkeeper, listen to me. These people killing each other really has nothing to do with me. This is an undeserved disaster. Eunuch Ma glanced at the middle-aged man and then turned to stare at Lu Narong. He sneered, what a fish dragon gang. Eunuch Song also turned his head while rubbing his neck. He laughed and said, what a fish dragon gang in Bailiang. Lu Narong's face instantly turned pale. The young minister of offerings beside her was full of anger and murderous intent. Zhao Shanhong, the steel opener, was gloating. He didn't care whether Lu Narong had received instructions from Mount Qing Liang or not. He only knew that after this assassination failed, it didn't matter whether Lu Narong was innocent or not. The Fish Dragon Gang, which was at the peak of its power in northern Liang Path, would soon usher in a major change of blood. After all, a new emperor would bring in new courtiers. As for whether Lu Narong would be able to get out of here alive, she would probably have to pray to Buddha and Bodhisattva for protection, right? Lu Narong didn't explain anything to the two great eunuchs of the Directorate of Credentials. She just looked at the second shopkeeper of the restaurant who was crying incessantly. Guixian, I only ask you one thing. Did you participate in tonight's matter? The middle-aged man named Guixian was a senior figure in the new Fish Dragon Gang. Not to mention Zhao Shanhong, the steel opener, he was even better than the young minister of offerings who joined 2 years ago. However, Guixian's martial arts were mediocre, but he was good at business management. he took a shortcut and quickly stood out. In the end, he became the second manager of this restaurant in Bayan Town. At that time, in the Fish Dragon Gang, this kind of transfer could only be regarded as an exile because Guxian was one of the few people who were loyal to Lu Nerong. He could drink with the old boss of the Fish Dragon Gang from time to time. Guxian left Lingzhou with his tail between his legs. In the end, it was a microcosm of Lu Nerong's power. Previously, no one thought that Guxian, who had no soldiers, generals, and little money, could make a comeback and get a place in the top management of the Fish Dragon Gang in Bayan Town. However, Guxian soon made everyone look at him in a new light. The restaurant and the brothel next door could be so prosperous because of Guxian. Lu Nerong, who already felt guilty about this person, was happy to see the Fish Dragon Gang prosper in Bayan Town. She even intended to promote him to a deacon with real power in the Fish Dragon Gang next year. It was not a high position, but it was powerful enough to control half of the Fish Dragon Gang's business. Guxian said with a sobbing tone, "Sect leader Lu, I'm just a weak commoner. Why would I kill someone when I can make a lot of money every day?" The shrewd eunuch Song smiled innocently. "Head shopkeeper, second shopkeeper, are you trying to play the role of the good cop? Isn't it a little too late?" On the street outside the restaurant, the sound of horse hooves could be heard. The murderous aura of the cavalry on the battlefield was completely different from the murderous aura of a grandmaster in Jianghu who could single-handedly defeat a country. However, it also made Jianghu feel like their guts were about to explode. At this moment, a warm and mellow voice with an obvious smile sounded throughout the entire third floor. It was filled with inappropriate teasing. "Eunuch Song, you can't say that. Otherwise, I'll charge you for tonight's green and wine." The voice was actually right beside Guxian's ears, but he had no idea why there was someone beside him. He was already full of anger. Now that he was being pushed into the fire pit by this guy with bad intentions, he could not put on a good face. He turned his head and said angrily, "Charge your mother's money. I have the final say on whether the green and wine will charge or not." Then he saw a handsome young face. Then he saw that this person had his hands hidden in his sleeves and a Bailiang blade hanging from his waist. In the current northern Liangdao, there was no longer any young general who dared to carry a cold saber in private. Not a single one. A hero with such courage was either still in prison or had already been in prison. In Bailiang, apart from the border army and the internal garrison, there were only two kinds of people who were allowed to openly wear cold blades by Mount Qingliang. One was the generals who had made outstanding military contributions but had already retired from the army. The other was the veteran soldiers who were born in the old barracks. These two kinds of people were mostly old people. Otherwise, they were high-ranking officials who were in the prime of their lives and had already transferred to the officialdom. The young man looked at Guxian with a smile and then looked around. Finally, he smiled and said, "In Bailiang, I have the final say." Chapter 1865. The ordinary guests who came to the restaurant to spend money were all scared witless. For example, the official who squatted under a table and cried bitterly. As a county official, he originally came to Bay and Town under the guise of observing the people's situation. He wanted to drink some harmless wine and prepare to go to the bed in the neighboring brothel after sacrificing his internal organs. He wanted to tame 1 or 2 rouge horses at the age of 50. How strong was he to throw away his pen and join the army? After knowing that someone had died, he also knew that it was not good to stay here for long. However, his legs were too weak to walk. Secondly, he was afraid that the group of evil people who killed without blinking would find him an eyesore and directly kill the innocent. At this wine table, the only one who was still sitting in the chair and continuing to drink was the foreign scholar who had almost no place in the yamen this year. As a weak scholar, he even slowly moved the screen away just to broaden his field of vision and take a glance at the bloody battlefield where the Jianghu immortals were fighting. What did it mean to be calm in every big event? That was probably it. However, his absurd action, which showed that he was a famous scholar, undoubtedly caused his colleagues in Bay and town to share a common enemy. Not all of the guests were willing to resign themselves to death. There were a few tables of Jianghu people who were trying to sneak down the stairs after the young master with the saber appeared. However, on the railing of the stairs, there was a beautiful woman in a crimson robe. She was like a bodhisattva standing in a Buddhist shrine. She was not angry, but she was majestic. There was no need for her to say anything. All the Jianghu people tactfully returned to their original positions. There was a smart guy who quietly opened the window and tried to jump down. In the end, he was scared out of his wits. He saw a head hanging upside down outside the window. After staring at each other, he did not say anything. He slowly closed the window. He was probably afraid that there would be a gap. He did not forget to pull the window in with all his strength. Only then did he sit back on the chair and silently said, "There are gods 3 feet above my head. If you have grievances, take revenge. Even if you are a ghost, don't look at me, Wang Jian, who is a man in his 30s. I am still a virgin. Young energy is the strongest. If you find me, be careful that both of us will be hurt." At this moment, the atmosphere was extremely subtle. Over at the blind female Guqin player Shui Songguan's side, the screen had already been knocked down by a young Miao woman in gorgeous clothes. She sat cross-legged on the chair and was in high spirits. She stared at the side profile of the young master with the saber, licked her lips and said, "So handsome." As her husband, Wei Miao, the #1 martial artist in Nanzhao, smiled and nodded. This unremarkable man had never cared about his wife's deviance. There were countless good things in the world, and it was best if his wife was happy. Su Su, whose real identity was the crown prince of the fallen Western Shu kingdom, had mixed feelings after seeing that guy again. Jealousy surged in his heart. Just based on this point, he could be considered as a fellow sufferer with the sword tomb sword crown, Wu Luding. At Lu Narong's table, other than Mao Shulang, Qing Baishuang and Ji Lu, and had already left their chairs. Lin Hongyuan, who was now the master of Southern Border's Dragon Palace, even jumped up. Farther away, the young hero of Bailing County, who had seen the immortals of the land and the fairies of Jianghu in one day, seemed to be about to cry. He felt that today, he had already walked through Jianghu for the rest of his life. Even if he retired from Jianghu tomorrow, he would have no regrets. It seemed that the only person left who was still in the dark was the restaurant's second shopkeeper Guxian. He was about to angrily glare at the young man who yawned like a toad, but he immediately shut his mouth. Because he found that the fat man called Eunuch Song looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His chubby cheeks trembled violently, but he couldn't say a word. A middle-aged assassin who was smashed to the ground by Ji Lu, An's wine cup gritted his teeth and said, "Su Fengmian." Almost at the same time, Eunuch Lu, the head of the ceremony directorate who hadn't stood up after sitting down tonight, finally slowly stood up. He bowed slightly, modest but not obsequious. His voice was steady as he said, "I greet the king of Bailiang. Earlier at the Dragon Horse River crossing, I was lacking in manners. I hope the king will be magnanimous enough to forgive me." The eunuchs of Graydon City, regardless of their rank, had no reason to kneel and greet a king of a different surname, not even a king of the imperial family. Once they held an imperial edict, even the relatives of the imperial family had to kneel and receive it. However, facing this king of the Northwest, Eunuch Lu, the head of the Directorate of Ribbon Insignia, didn't dare to have such extravagant hopes. Even Song Tonglu, the head of the Ceremony Directorate, didn't have such thoughts. In the past, it was because of the 300,000 cavalry of Bailiang behind him. Now, there was another reason related to him, and that was the battle between the Celestials and the Imperial Astronomer. The portraits of the ancestors of the Dragon Tiger Mountain, which had been worshipped by the Zhao family of Liang for generations, were not many left now. Guxian, who was slow to realize, was about to make up for his mistake when he heard the young king laughing softly. "Second shopkeeper, that's enough, stop acting." Guixian froze on the spot. Su Fengnian looked at the three eunuchs and Commander Qian of the Imperial Guards, who looked as if he was facing a great enemy. After retracting his gaze, he looked at the second shopkeeper of the restaurant in front of him again. There is no need to use martial arts to kill people. Whether it's the group of weaklings lying on the ground, the 4 assassins of the deer-reaping tower, or even the servant hiding in the fish dragon gang, none of them are the real killing moves. In the end, it still depends on you, the backbone, and the poison you put in their food and drink, right? The Meow woman in the distance clapped her hands and cheered. "You have a handsome appearance, and a good eye." Guixian's face was uncertain, but in the end, he felt relieved. He quietly straightened his back, turned around and looked at the young king, and laughed. "You are indeed one of the 4 Grand Masters of martial arts. You are worthy of the king of Beiliang. You are worthy of the son of the butcher Su Shao. 3 worthy, in a row." This middle-aged man, who was too smart, laughed crazily and desolately, incomparably tragic. Su Fengnian looked around again. The assassins of the deer-reaping tower who had died, the remnants of the spring and autumn period who had died, the eunuchs of the ribbon-sealing supervisor who were standing, and Lin Hongyuan's table further away. He said to himself, "It's all technical work." Guixian sneered, but he was not afraid. Su Fengnian curled his lips. "The poison you bought with a lot of money or carefully made is very slow to take effect. When they are terminally ill, they should have died before they arrived at Mount Qingliang. It was a method used by the imperial court of the spring and autumn period to deal with the Grand Masters of Jianghu. It is said that it can easily destroy the invincible body of Vidra." Guixian's eyes were filled with bone-deep hatred and pleasure, and he laughed evilly. "What, do you think you can pry the formula of the antidote out of my mouth?" Su Fengnian wanted to say something, but stopped. In the end, he just shook his head and said indifferently, "I don't expect it. There are some things that don't make sense." Chapter 1866. A trace of blood suddenly oozed out from the corner of Guixian's mouth. It was dark and horrifying. Before he fell to the ground and died, this remnant of the spring and autumn period who painstakingly created this assassination murmured, "I, Guixian Xiang, have lived half of my life. It's a worthy death." The middle-aged man on the ground who shouted the name of Su Fengnian raised his arm high and was about to smash his head to commit suicide. However, a young woman who fell not far from him, who was supposed to enjoy the adoration of countless young men in Jianghu, looked up at the young king. She broke down and looked pitiful with tears and snot all over her face. She cried, "King of Beiliang, don't kill me. I don't want to die. I really don't want to die. I've sacrificed too much for revenge. I don't owe my family anything." The woman's mournful cry echoed in the restaurant. Perhaps no one realized that this was the only cry in tonight's battle where everyone was fighting for their lives. Some of the remnant of the 8 kingdoms of spring and autumn who regarded Su Shao as the culprit of the fall of the Central Plains chose to die for their country in the face of the tragic situation where the mountains and rivers were destroyed. Therefore, in the capital of Western Shu, there were many people who chose to escape. These people formed Hongjia who ran to the north, and some people who chose to hide. Therefore, in the various Jianghu sects where the dynasties were destroyed, there were many unfamiliar worshippers and young disciples, many rich and powerful families with deep courtyards, many babies in swaddling clothes, and many men and women who seemed to be hurriedly married because of love at first sight. In many temples, academies, and even brothels, there were many more scholarly old men in the former, and many more beautiful women who were clearly graceful like the daughters of noble families in the latter. In the War of Spring and Autumn, Su Shao, the great general of Liang, killed so many people that the Central Plains was filled with the smoke of war. He killed so many powerful clans of Spring and Autumn who had sat and watched the founding and fall of the previous dynasties become a thing of the past. After that, Su Xiao led the Iron Horse in Jianghu from the south to the north and almost killed everyone in Jianghu. However, he still couldn't kill all the people in the sects and clans who hated their country. If you can't get rid of the roots of the weeds, they'll grow again when the spring breeze blows. Therefore, whenever Bailiang and His Royal Highness went out, people would die. The remnants of the spring and autumn period would die, and so would the Whispering Room. In those years, the number of assassins who had launched sneak attacks on Mount Qingliang was even more numerous than the number of carps crossing the river. In the end, even the maidservants who lived with Wutong day and night would also die. Moreover, the two maidservants whom His Royal Highness had personally helped to give nicknames to, died with a little shame but no regrets. Su Fengnian could still clearly remember the first assassination that startled Wutong'an. It was the middle of a snowy winter night. He ran out of the house without boots and stood on the steps, looking at the heavily guarded small courtyard. Everywhere he looked, there were dead bodies. The snow was soaked with blood and then covered with snow. In the end, it was a vast expanse of white. At that time, the man whose legs weren't so lame and whose back wasn't so hunched also didn't wear boots. He walked up the steps and stood shoulder to shoulder with the youth. He had the imperial bodyguards in iron armor carry the bodies away. He laughed and said, "In this life, Father has too many enemies. I can't count them all, and I'm too lazy to count them. Son, are you afraid?" The youth didn't know if he was cold or scared, but his teeth chattered. However, he still stubbornly said, "What's there to be afraid of?" At that time, the man whose hair wasn't completely white took off the old mink coat he was wearing and put it on the youth. He laughed loudly and said, "You're a descendant of our old Su family." The youth rolled his eyes. He grabbed the warm mink coat with both hands and quickly ran back to the house. The man who hadn't been called father by his son since the death of his wife turned around and walked down the steps. He strode out of the courtyard. However, as soon as he stepped out of the courtyard, he lost his heroic spirit. He was so cold that he almost jumped. When he caught a glimpse of his adopted son, Yuan Zhuozong, he kicked him without saying anything. The latter was at a loss. The man stared at him and lowered his voice. Two words came out from his teeth, "Take off your boots." Unfortunately, the funny scene couldn't be seen by the youth. At this time, on the third floor, an angry shout interrupted the woman's crying. "Shut up!" The woman was suddenly stunned. Then, her heart-wrenching cry turned into a low sob. The middle-aged assassin said sternly to the young woman, "I'm from the Chongshan Song family. We've been loyal for generations. We'll never shame our ancestors." After saying this, the middle-aged man's eyes flashed a complicated look. Finally, he suddenly raised his arm and slapped the woman's forehead. 20 years of living in humiliation, only to die for innocence. This was the only wish of the Song family's man. As for what the younger generation of the family thought, he didn't care. Although the woman could summon up the courage to beg for mercy from the king of Bailiang, she had exhausted all her energy. At this time, she didn't have any courage to resist the anger of the elders of the family. Su Fengnian, who had been gentle, suddenly became furious. The next moment, he appeared in front of the man on the ground and stepped on the head of the man who tried to put justice before family. The assassin, who was killed in an instant, slid several feet away. Su Fengnian took a deep breath and quickly stabilized the qi in his body. Ordinary martial artists did not feel much pressure from the sudden burst of aura. Even Lin Hongyuan only felt a little suffocated. However, Wei Miao, Mao Shulang, Qing Baishuang, Ji Lu and Xue Songguan, these 5 martial arts grandmasters, almost simultaneously raised their auras to the peak. The blind female zither player even pressed her hands heavily on the zither strings. Mao Shulang, who had stood up, almost pulled out his saber from its sheath. Su Fengnian looked at the young guardian beside Lu Nerong and nodded. The latter silently stepped forward and made a cryptic gesture. As the young guardian made this gesture, 3 men and women of completely different identities quickly walked out from the 3rd floor. One was a bartender from a neighboring brothel, one was an old waiter with a cotton towel on his shoulder and a wine jug in his hand, and the last was a local of Bailiang who had originally been accompanying a group of new heroes to watch the show. The 4 began to clean up the battlefield together, carrying all the survivors of the spring and autumn period who were still alive down the stairs. No one was interested in whether to drag them out and kill them, or torture them until they were better off dead. If no one recognized the identities of these 4 people by now, then they really had been kicked in the head by a donkey. They were either spies raised by the water whisking room, or men of sacrifice raised by the eagle raising room, or both. The restaurant belonged to the fish dragons, but Lu Narong had always been an outsider. Su Fingnian turned his head to look at the 3 eunuchs of the Ribbon Insignia Directorate and said expressionlessly, "Don't worry about the poisoning. Also, when you reach Mount Qingliang, put down the imperial edict and you can return to Great Peace City." Eunuch Lu didn't speak and led the way to the stairs. But when he passed by the young king, he intentionally or unintentionally slowed down, his eyes full of questions. When the head eunuch of the Ribbon Insignia Directorate brushed past him, Su Fingnian whispered as if he was speaking in riddles, "Tell him, she's fine." Eunuch Lu looked straight ahead, but bent his waist slightly and then sped up. Chapter 1867. After the group of powerful but slightly embarrassed eunuchs left, Su Fingnian walked to Lu Narong's table. Before he sat down, he waved at Su and the others and said with a smile, "Shortcake, Miss Shui, and Uncle Chi, come and sit here. The more people, the merrier." Su Fingnian was the first to sit down. Lin Hongyuan, Mao Shulang, Qing Baishuang, Ji Luhen, Lu Narong, Zhao Shanhong, and another old consecrator from Fish Dragon Gang. In addition, Shui Songwan, the swordsmith surnamed Shi who once gave Su Fingnian the famous sword Spring and Autumn, and Wei Miao, a woman from Miaojiang. The woman in a vermilion gown was naturally Su Ying, and the female ghost who hung upside down outside the window to bask in the moonlight was obviously Miss Hehe, Jia Jia. Both of them had just arrived at Bay and Town tonight. The reason was simple, it was boring to stay in Mount Qingliang. Su Weisheng was also worried about Su Fingnian, so he asked them to bring them here. A table could only fit 9 chairs at most, but there were so many chairs here. Naturally, it was impossible for everyone to have a seat. Fortunately, Su Ying and Miss Hehe did not care to sit on the chairs at all. The 2 of them rushed to a screen not far away that had been spared from the disaster. Su Ying stood while the girl squatted. The latter gnawed on a roast chicken that she had stolen from somewhere and spat out bones all over the floor in just a few bites. Then, she wiped her greasy hands on Su Ying's red robe. Su Ying smiled happily. After Su Fingnian, it was actually Su, who could be defeated by anyone with a single hand, who moved a chair over and sat down first. Zhao Shanhong was the first to kneel down. With both hands on the floor, he said to the young vassal king in a trembling voice, "Zhao Shanhong from Fish Dragon Gang greets the prince." This #1 expert of the underworld in Ji Bei was beaten up like a stray dog by the mad dog Yuan Tingshan, and that was the reason why he came to the Fish Dragon Gang to live under someone else's roof. If his memories served him correctly, this young vassal king had once beaten the arrogant mad dog Yuan to death in front of Gu Jiantang, the great pillar of Great Peace City. For Zhao Shanhong, who believed that the fist was the law, he sincerely thought that kneeling down in front of the leader of the Bailiang cavalry was the blessing of his previous life. Su nodded, "Get up." Then, he turned to look at the leader of Fish Dragon Gang and asked with a smile, "Of course, why don't you sit down? Don't tell me you're putting on airs now that you've become the gang leader." Lu Narong, who originally wanted to just stand, hesitated for a moment. In the end, she still sat in her original seat, which happened to be on Su Fingnian's right. The old consecrator, who used to put on airs in front of Lu Narong, swallowed his saliva. If there was a hard brick in his hand, he would have knocked himself out. After Zhao Shanhong got up, he quietly came behind Lu Nerong and stood side by side with the old consecrator, who also had a solemn and respectful face. On the third floor of the restaurant, except for them, no one had left. In addition to the joy of surviving the disaster, there were also some thoughts that were not known to outsiders. In Jianghu, in addition to ability, experience was very important. Experience. Once you met someone, it was the same as getting to know someone. Since you know Su Fengnian, who is both an Earth Immortal and the Northwest Vassal King, you can brag about it for 7 or 8 years in Jianghu. Lin Hongyuan, Mao Shulang, Qing Baishuang, and Ji Lu, and sat down again. Su Su, Wei Miao, and the women from Miaojiang moved their chairs and sat down. No matter how Su Su tried to persuade him, Xue Songguan just stood behind him with his zither in his arms. The swordsmithing master surnamed Qi also did not sit down. In this way, there were exactly 9 people. Su Fengnian opened the clay seal of a pot of green ant wine and poured a cup of wine for Lu Nerong and Mao Shulang, who were close to him. After pouring a cup of wine for himself, he smiled and said, "I will not be polite. Everyone, please pour your own wine. How good you are when you are drunk, you can't be persuaded to drink. As for the people who persuade others to drink, they are even worse when they are drunk." Ji Lu, and raised his cup to the young vassal king and drank it in one gulp. Dragon Palace Ji Lu, and is honored to meet the prince. Qing Baishuang also raised his cup. Nanjiang commoner Qing Baishuang, this cup of wine is the same as brother Ji's. Wei Miao drank a cup of wine by himself and said in a deep voice, "Wei Miao." Su Fengnian returned a cup of wine to each of them. Lin Hongyuan was just about to raise his cup, but for some reason, he gave up after meeting the young vassal king's eyes. The Miaojiang woman didn't use a cup. She directly picked up the wine pot and drank a big mouthful of wine. She stared at Su Fengnian's face and said with a smile, "You look so handsome, your mother must be very beautiful." Su Fengnian smiled brightly and said, "This sister looks like a straightforward person." Wei Miao smiled knowingly. Only Su Su crossed her arms in front of her chest and snorted coldly. Su Fengnian glanced at his old friend from Beimang. "Yo, shortcake, no, now I have to call you Master Su. I heard that you have made a name for yourself in Shishu and Nanzhao. What, this time you also came to Beiliang to participate in the Wudang Martial Arts Symposium? You are not afraid that with you here, the others can only compete for the second place in the world?" Su Su's face turned red and she almost had internal injuries on the spot. She blurted out, "Surnamed Su." "Bullshit." Su Fengnian hurriedly poured himself a cup of wine and pretended to panic. "You are indeed Master Su, the invincible master of Shishu and Zhao. I need to drink a cup of wine to calm my nerves." Su Su stood up and slammed the table angrily. "I'll drink your grandpa." "Surnamed Su, are you looking for a beating?" Not to mention Lin Hongyuan and the other guests from Nanjiang, even Lu Nerong and Wei Miao were speechless. They couldn't understand this guy's stupidity. Did he come from his mother's womb? This surnamed Su guy's martial arts were terrible, but they didn't expect him to be so daring. Zhao Shanhong and the consecrator firmly believed that this seemingly mediocre young man must be a top master in the world. Su Fengnian laughed. Come on, I beg you." Su Su sat down at lightning speed and said righteously, "A gentleman uses his mouth, not his fists." Zhao Shanhong's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. After Su Su's ruckus, the originally dull atmosphere became much more relaxed. Everyone at the table had complicated backgrounds, so it wasn't easy to talk about anything. Su Fengnian drank about a jug and a half before saying that he wanted to go downstairs to say goodbye and end the table. Lin Hongyuan and Lu Nerong met here because they had something to discuss, so they stayed on the 3rd floor. Su Su and the others didn't want to stay either, but Wei Miao took the initiative to toast Qing Baishuang and Ji Lu. Both sides could be considered old acquaintances. Earlier, they each represented the Prince of Shu, Chen Jibao, and the Prince of Yan, Zhao Bing, to a small town in Liaodong to meet with the Great Pillar State, Gu Jiantang. At that time, the three sides parted on bad terms. The world was unpredictable, and no one could have predicted that in the end, these two vassal kings would join forces to rebel. Between the heroes of the world, even if they served different masters, it didn't prevent them from appreciating each other. Moreover, they were now considered a family, so there was no need to hold grudges. Su Fengnian returned to the second floor and saw that it was empty. There was only the grandfather and grandson sitting at the table by the window. Seeing that Su Fengnian returned safe and sound, the old man was relieved. Although the head of Jinsua Knife Manor, Tong Shanquan, was expressionless, his brows relaxed a little. Chapter 1868. After Su Fengnian sat down, the old man asked, "How is it?" Su Fengnian, who had drunk quite a bit tonight, let out a long sigh. Other than the smell of alcohol, he was also depressed. He smiled and said, "It's fine now. When we're outside, we have to rely on our friends. Although there's a lot of commotion upstairs, my friends can handle it." She wasn't a young virgin, but she was a young saber master. She frowned again and said in a low voice, "Just now, there was someone with a particularly strong aura. He's at least a heavenly phenomenon expert." The old man said unhappily, "It must be that way, meow." After that fellow joined the King of Shu, he became even more confident. Instead of being a master of the pugilistic world, he chose to be an official's lackey. I must have been blind to think that he was a real man a few years ago. Su Fengnian didn't say a word about this. In an instant, Tong Shanquan had already stood up. Her left hand pressed on the hilt of a long saber on her right waist. The saber was unsheathed by an inch. However, it was unknown whether the saber she was holding was a martial virtue or a heavenly treasure. Su Fengnian was helpless. The three of them were near the window. At this moment, two heads were hanging upside down, staring at the three of them. Su Fengnian rubbed his forehead and smiled bitterly. "Manor Lord Tong, don't misunderstand. They're my family." The old man surnamed Tong was dumbstruck. He looked at Brother Su, then at the two heads outside the window. Even with Tong Shanchuan's unwavering determination, his mouth was slightly agape. From this, it could be seen that Su Ying and Miss Hehe weren't very well received, especially at night. Jia Jia chuckled 3 times, curled his lips, and disappeared in a flash. Su Ying followed suit and chuckled 3 times before disappearing as well. The atmosphere was awkward. No one spoke. Fortunately, Su and the others came down from the 3rd floor. Su clicked her tongue and said, "Yo, Su, you're spending time with a stranger again. How busy?" Then, Su raised her voice and said sincerely to Tong Shanquan, "Miss, please ignore that pervert. He already has 3 wives and 4 concubines. Even his children can climb trees and dig out bird nests." Su Fengnian laughed angrily, "Scram." Su gave him a thumbs up. "You teach me first." Su Fengnian pretended to get up, but Su simply ran away like a wisp of smoke. Wei Miao and the Miaojiang woman came downstairs after Su, Shui Songguan, and the swordsmith. The old man with the surname Tong turned his head and snorted coldly. This made Wei Miao, who wanted to greet the old man, continue to go downstairs. However, the Miaojiang woman with the enchanting figure threw a wink at Su Fengnian and did not forget to give him a thumbs up. The old man, who hadn't drunk a single drop of wine since Su Fengnian had entered the building, subconsciously reached out to pick up the wine jug. He shook it a little, but it was empty. After putting down the jug, he said unhappily, "Young Master Su, why don't you tell this old man everything? Tell me straight." Su Fengnian said seriously, "How about I drink 2 more jugs with you?" Otherwise, I'm afraid I won't be able to drink anymore. The old man's face darkened. I'm not drinking. Su Fingnian continued, according to the restaurant's rules, if someone can drink 6 jugs of green ant wine in a day, they won't even charge for the food. I'll drink 1.5 jugs. The old man was indeed experienced. He immediately said decisively, then drink. This time, it was Tong Shanquan who rubbed his forehead. There were no more waiters on the second floor. So, Su Fingnian had to personally go to the counter and rummage through the cabinets to get the 2 jugs of wine. He also got 2 plates of peanuts. He held the jug between his arms and held the plates with both hands. The only thing missing was a white cotton towel on his shoulders. When Tong Shanquan saw him like this, he asked in a low voice, "Grandpa, can this be that person?" At that time, the old man was just casually talking nonsense to his granddaughter. The corners of his mouth twitched, but he didn't say anything. Drinking was drinking, but silence was silence. Su Fingnian was bored to death. He would occasionally point at the table. After drinking 2 jugs of wine, the old man stood up shakily and said calmly, "I'm leaving." Su Fingnian nodded. "Then I won't see you out." The old man waved his hand and strode away. Su Fingnian looked at Tong Shanquan's back as he walked further and further away. He asked with a smile, "May I ask Miss Tong, which one is the 6th most famous blade in the world?" Tong Shanquan stopped in his tracks. His right hand gently touched the hilt of a long blade at his waist. Su Fingnian said slowly, "A sharp blade cuts through the water. The blade doesn't damage the blade, and the water doesn't leave a trace." Tong Shanquan said the same thing when he met Su Fingnian before. "Thank you." The autumn of the 3rd year of Xiangfu was particularly eventful. The king of Yanqi, Xiao Bing, and the king of Shu, Chen Zhibao, raised their troops together. Half of the territory south of Guangling River fell. The Liang imperial court had no choice but to let Lu Xingxiang and Wu Zhongshuan lead troops south again. The assistant minister of the Ministry of War, Su Gong, replaced Kai Nan, who had resigned due to illness. He was in charge of controlling the northern border army between Beiliang and the 2 Liao provinces. The imperial court conferred the king of Beiliang, Su Fingnian, as the pillar of the state. At the same time, he also conferred posthumous titles to Lu Jinu, Wang Lingbao, and all the heroes who died outside the Great Pass. He also made an exception and set up 2 deputy Jingshi and Jidushi in Beiliang. The former Liangzhou provincial governor, Lu Dongjiang, became the number 2 civil official in Beiliang. Su Beiji and Yang Xinqing were both deputy Jidushi. In the Battle of Miyun Pass, Chao Wei and an originally unknown general surnamed Xia annihilated Zhong Tan's cavalry. Only Xia Zhoubo and Zhong Tan led a dozen or so Zhong family elite cavalry to break out of the encirclement. In this battle, they successfully forced Lan to a mountain, who had already accepted the title of Guoshi of Beimang, to change sides. 20,000 monk soldiers rushed to the aid of Qingcang City in Liuzhou. Yu Wandao led more than 10,000 light cavalry to bypass the Gentleman's Pavilion and several important border towns of Gusai Prefecture. His lone army penetrated deep into Beimang's southern court hinterland and pointed at Shijing, shaking the 2 dynasties of Beimang. The Beimang royal court spread the news that after the empress heard about the crushing defeat at Miyun Pass, she was so angry that she fell ill and couldn't get up. Crown Prince Yelu Hong temporarily took charge of the southern expedition. Yelu Hongkai, an elder of 3 dynasties, was given the title of Shijing's chief assistant, assisting His Highness the Crown Prince. Among them, Yelu Dongchuang, a member of the king's tent, was appointed as the right assistant minister of the Ministry of War in Shijing. At the same time, he was conferred the title of Jinghua General, controlling 4 important military towns, including the Gentleman's Pavilion. Afterwards, the rebel army of the 2 kings of Liang did not immediately launch an attack to the north. Instead, they quickly nibbled away the vast territory south of the Guangling River. But just when the entire Liang officialdom and army mistakenly thought that the king of Yen was going to establish himself as the emperor, the Central Plains ushered in a huge and far-reaching shock. It was rumored that the two kings of Liang were going to raise the king of Jing'an, Zhao Sun, to the throne because of his loyalty to the orthodox Zhao family. The eyes and thoughts of the world were all focused on this series of shocking changes. Among them, the crown prince of Yanji, Zhao Zhu, was still calm and collected. He also did not pay attention to the small place in Liangzhou called Bei and Town. On that night, behind the thick smell of blood, there was real blood. The real blood, there was no blood. On the contrary, it was the warmth of the past, the life and death of the past. On the second floor of a big restaurant, Su Fengnian sat alone on a bench, closing his eyes and taking a nap. When Su Fengnian opened his eyes, Lu Nerong was standing alone at the table. Seeing that she was not the woman he expected, the young king was relieved. Even if he was destined to meet the other woman, it was always good to meet her a little later. This was like His Royal Highness who had returned from traveling Jianghu. He knew that Su Xiao was starting to grow old, but it was better to be slower. Chapter 1869. Looking at the leader of the fish dragons, Su Fengnian said softly, "Sit down." Lu Nerong nodded and sat opposite him. Su Fengnian asked with a smile, "Do you feel tired?" Lu Nerong smiled. She looked tired, but her eyes were bright. "Probably a little more relaxed than you." Su Fengnian poured a glass of wine for Lu Nerong and joked, "I won't persuade you to drink. You're really casual. It's not appropriate for a man and a woman to get drunk." Lu Nerong dismissed it with a smile. She didn't pretend to drink it all in one gulp. She just took a small sip. When the meaning was there, the meaning was there. Su Fengnian didn't drink. Instead, he put his hands in his sleeves and said slowly, "Hot, annoyed, and cool, but only in the state of mind. Therefore, there is no cold or heat in the Buddhist land, and the immortal city is like the three springs. It's just that we are mortals after all, and it's difficult for us to reach this state. Even if we do, it may not last long. In the end, there are two kinds of people in the world who live the easiest lives. One is the really generous people. Some people scold the old and clumsy, but the old and clumsy only say yes. Some people beat the old and clumsy, but the old and clumsy just fall asleep. The other kind is the really petty people. They will seek revenge for the smallest grievance. They pay attention to kindness and hatred, and they can even repay kindness with with good conscience. The former only cares about retreating, while the latter only cares about climbing up. Lu Nerong asked, "What about you?" Su Fengnian grinned and said, "Of course I'm the former of the latter. I'm not a good person, and I can't be a good hypocrite. I can't rely on either side. So I'm very depressed at the moment." Lu Nerong was not amused. Instead, she lowered her head and said in a low voice, "The fish dragons." Su Fengnian interrupted her and said, "Do you know why I want you to be the leader of the fish dragons? You may think that I need an additional source of soldiers, or that I've been coveting your beauty for a long time." Lu Nerong, who didn't know whether to laugh or cry, looked up and found that his expression was actually very serious. Su Fengnian said calmly, "None of them. My original idea was very simple. I felt that the Jianghu of Beiliang needed one or two heroines like the one I had envisioned when I was young. It didn't matter whether she was good at martial arts or not, but she was full of righteousness. She was in high spirits and could pass judgment on the world. She was born with a chivalrous heart and was willing to lend a helping hand when she saw injustice. Then I looked around and found a girl called Lu Nerong from a small gang. She also happened to like the Jianghu and had gone through thick and thin with me." Lu Nerong suddenly smiled. "I believe you." Su Fengnian teased, "Because you're stupid, you believe whatever others say." Lu Nerong laughed at herself and did not deny it. At this moment, Su Fengnian realized that she was really tired. If it had been the Lu Nerong who escorted Bei Mang back then, she would have been at loggerheads with him. Even if she felt guilty, she liked to talk back. Su Fengnian said, "I will find someone to replace you as the leader of the fish dragons. Please apologize to the old leader for me. After all, the fish dragons is his life's work." Lu Nerong nodded. She seemed to be a completely different person. She asked curiously, "What's going on tonight? Can you tell me?" River crossing dragon, Great Lake flood dragon, wild mountain python, cave snake, and pond carp. I feel like I've gathered all of them. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Why can't I tell you? When I was still the heir of Beiliang, there weren't many fools who were willing to go to Mount Qingliang to seek trouble. After I became a prince and a martial arts grandmaster, the majority of the spring and autumn period survivors who hid in Beiliang were close to despair and gave up. Since they couldn't go to Mount Qingliang to assassinate me and couldn't throw away their lives in vain under the watchful eyes of the cavalry outside the pass, what could they do? They could only resentfully wait for death. Afterwards, the fish dragons rose rapidly. At the time, there were rumors that I had an ambiguous relationship with you. Naturally, there were many people who made a last resort and infiltrated the fish dragons, waiting for an opportunity to make a move. The second shopkeeper of this restaurant, Guoxian, was one of them. His real name was Guoxuanxiang, a descendant of the martyrs of northern Han. His father and Fan Xiaochai's grandfather were both pillars of the country. One was scholarly and the other was martial arts. However, even Fu Shuifang didn't expect that the Guo family's youngest son, whose corpse had been identified, would still be alive. Moreover, he was right under our noses. As for the consecrated member of your fish dragons who attempted to smash the head of the ribbon sealing bureau's eunuch into mush, he was even more deeply hidden. Even the sacrificial warrior from the eagle raising room who stayed by your side under the alias of Qi Hanshi has not been able to uncover his true identity. Now that he is dead, it will be difficult to follow the vine to the melon. That middle-aged man who claimed to be from the Song family of Chongshan was born into one of the prominent families of the old southern Tang. Although the destruction of the southern Tang was caused by Gu Jiantang, I presume that the Song family had a reason for placing the blame on me. Those 4 assassins should have come from a sect called the Deer Reaping House. Their style is distinct and cannot be underestimated. I believe that while the survivors of the spring and autumn period may be able to invite ordinary assassins from the Deer Reaping House, they definitely wouldn't be able to invite that level of elite sacrificial warriors. Therefore, it's hard to say how deep the secret behind this is, but it's definitely not shallow. At this point, Su Fengnian smiled faintly, as if he had noticed that there were still some peanuts left on the plate. He took one out of his sleeve and tossed it into his mouth. I won't care about the others for now, but since this Deer Reaping House has the guts to establish a sect in Jianghu and dares to swagger over to Beiliang to arm wrestle with me, then I'll take it as accepting a life-or-death battle invitation. Lu Nerong was puzzled. You're going to visit them in person? Su Fengnian couldn't help but laugh. The Battle of Liangmang is imminent, why would I go to the Central Plains? However, back then, the Wu family's sword mound sent hundreds of cavalry and swords to Liangmang, and they were all under my command. Not all of the swordsmen were willing to die outside the pass. Moreover, many of them wanted to return to their homeland. There were about 20 of them. Originally, I wanted them to symbolically go to the gourd mouth of Yuzhou to kill once or twice. Each of them could kill 100 enemies, and that would be a way out for both sides. Now, Lu Nerong also bent over to pick up a peanut and put it into her mouth. You want the 20 cavalry of the Wu family to go directly to the Deer Reaping House to cause trouble. Chapter 1870. Su Fengnian raised his eyebrows. Of course not. The Beimang barbarians still have to kill 100 people before going to the Central Plains to flatten the Deer Reaper Tower. Lu Nerong rolled her eyes. You sure know how to do business. Su Fengnian snorted. This is called swallows holding mud in their mouths. Good housekeeping. After saying this proudly, the great king of Baliang tossed a peanut high into the air and caught it with his mouth open. Lu Nerong was speechless. The small plate of peanuts was quickly devoured by the two. Lu Nerong thought for a long time and finally couldn't help but ask, those people obviously didn't even want to assassinate you, so why did they still do it by hook or by crook? Don't they know that once Baliang and Liang become enemies, not only will the Baliang cavalry suffer, but also the people of the Central Plains? Su Fengnian waved his hand and said casually, didn't I tell Guishuanxiang earlier upstairs that some things can be justified by both sides? This kind of reasoning doesn't work. Lu Nerong's face darkened. She wanted to say something but stopped. She could only sigh. Su Fengnian thought for a while and said slowly, some people really have nothing left. They're just hanging on by their last breath. If you want them to swallow that last breath, it's worse than killing them. So what can you say? You haven't experienced the spring and autumn war, so some things are harder to understand. As for me, it's only because I'm my father's son that I have more than you. No matter what, the grudges of my father's generation are there. It's only right for the son to pay the father's debts. However, if someone really has the ability to kill me, I'll admit it. If they don't, then don't blame me for killing faster. It's always a good thing to think deeply, but it's also not a bad thing to solve problems in a simple way. Lu Nerong asked, you're talking about these things so calmly. Su Fengnian said unhappily, what else can I do? Others are about to stab me with a knife, and I still have to ask those heroes to put down their knives first, and talk about how it's better to squash enmity than keep it alive. It was clearly a waste of energy, and his heart was tired. What was the point? I've thought it through a long time ago. It's not worth getting angry over this kind of thing. Otherwise, with my petty temper, I would have long been driven mad by those bastards who died more righteously than the other. Lu Nerong had a strange look on her face. Su Fengnian was somewhat resentful. Suddenly, he blinked and patted the cold saber on his waist. Su Shao left this for me. Who am I afraid of? At the very least, even if I were to die from anger one day, I would definitely die after those people, at least 100 years later. Lu Nerong yawned. Su Fengnian got up and said with concern, you should sleep early. Otherwise, there will be more wrinkles at the corner of your eyes. Lu Nerong smiled and said, please. Get lost. Stay away. Su Fengnian gave her a thumbs up. This heroine is really a sentimental person. Without waiting for Su Fengnian to finish flattering, Lu Nerong had already stood up. With her hands behind her back, she turned and left with light steps. It turned out that she was still wearing a ponytail as before. She swayed gently. Like a rippling river. Su Fengnian left the restaurant and walked on the street. The farther he went from the restaurant and brothel, the quieter it became. Then Su Fengnian saw that figure. He knew that she would wait for him, but he didn't want her to appear. His originally comfortable mood gradually became heavy. However, when Lin Hongyuan saw this young vassal king, he was still the guy who brought her countless nightmares by the spring god lake. He looked sloppy, but in fact, he was extremely shrewd and sinister. The two of them walked together. Although they were chatting, after all, both of their identities were there. It couldn't be trivial matters. Instead, it involved the recent trend of the Guangling Road War, Liang and Zhao Guo's strong infiltration of the current Jianghu, and the latest deployment of the two vast border armies under Gu Jiantang. In the end, it couldn't be said that they parted happily, but it also couldn't be said that they parted unhappily. In short, it was lukewarm. Su Fengnian was leaving Bay and town tonight, and Lin Hongyuan was returning to the inn in town. After that, she would participate in the Wudang Martial Arts Symposium as the Palace Master of the Dragon Palace. Therefore, it was Su Fengnian who sent Lin Hongyuan to the entrance of the inn for the first time. While the latter was flattered, her beautiful face was also full of resentment. You Su Fengnian don't want me to warm your bed, do you? Of course, Su Fengnian didn't have the leisure time. He turned and left. Lin Hongyuan had the thought of calling out to him, but in the end, she didn't speak. She looked at the slender figure that was gradually disappearing into the distance. He held the back of his head with both hands, leisurely. Previously in the restaurant, Su Fengnian and Lu Narong had been frank and honest about many things. But there were some things that Su Fengnian didn't say. For example, why Lin Hongyuan and the other three would suddenly decide to meet you in Bay and town, why it happened to be when the eunuchs of the Ribbon Insignia Institute were staying at the Green Horse Post, and why you, Lu Narong, happened to be delayed by a day on the road. Little beggar, you want to be the emperor, I know. Then why don't you come to Beiliang yourself, come here and treat me to a drink, and then directly tell me, brother, Xiao Zhu, will definitely sit on that dragon throne, how about it? But he didn't bring wine. It was Lin Hongyuan who had come to Beiliang. There was no banquet that didn't end in this world. After Su Fengnian walked out of Bay and town, he headed west. Su Ying and Miss He He only followed from a distance. He went to a place where people rarely went. Su Fengnian, who was flying like a rainbow in the sky, suddenly floated to the ground, raised his arm high, and put two fingers together to form a sword, shouting, "Two-sleeved green snake." A bright sword aura rolled like a green dragon, especially stunning and spectacular in the deep night. Su Fengnian repeated the words, "Two-sleeved green snake," again and again. So between Bay and town and Liangzhou city, between heaven and earth, there were endless green rainbows. Sword aura rushed to the sky. I have a sword that burns the sun and spits out clouds, swallows the river and the moon. I have a sword that opens the earth with qi, and shakes the heavens. I have a sword that destroys mountains and shakes cities, and thousands of soldiers flee. When Su Fengnian approached Liangzhou city, the sweaty young king lay on the ground, panting desperately. Su Fengnian looked at the sky with all his might, and grinned, "Without wine and beauties, I don't want to come to this world. Without fast sword friends, I don't want to stay in this Jianghu." Old man wearing a sheepskin coat, you said it well. Chapter 1871. Before Lu province was recognized by the Liang imperial court as the fourth province of Beiliang, Mount Qingliang had already started to build two large courier roads. They started from Qingyuan military town, which controlled the west gate of Liangzhou, and Jishou Pass, which was northwest of Lingzhou. They led to Qingsang City, where the provincial governor's mansion was located. The tragic Battle of Miyun Pass had just ended when three caravans entered Qingsang City under the protection of the elite cavalry and the men of sacrifice of the Fushuwei chamber. The backbone of the three carriages was the same. They were all provincial governors and generals of their respective provinces. They were fully deserving of their titles. Liangzhou had Shifu Baiyu, Yuzhou had Song Yan, Huangfu Ji, and Lingzhou had Chang Sui and Han Laozhan. Of the six, three provincial governors had taken office in the third year of the auspicious talisman. This was especially true for Baiyu, the newly appointed provincial governor of Liangzhou. He had shocked the officials of the northern Liang Path. No one had expected that Mr. White Lotus of Mount Longhu would become a subject of the Su family. In comparison, Chang Sui, who was the disciple of Shangyin Academy's Dao Master Han Guzi and Su Weisheng's senior brother, rose to become the provincial governor of Lingzhou in one step. As for Song Yan, who was originally from Lingzhou, he took advantage of the situation and became the #1 civil official in Yuzhou. Today, everyone in Beiliang knew that this ruthless official, who worshipped magic, was connected with the new Liang prince when he was temporarily the general of Lingzhou. He was one of the second ministers to join the new king, second only to Li Gongda, Huangfu Ji, and Han Laozhan. When the three caravans entered Qingsang City from east to west, another group of people entered from west to east. Including the provincial governor of Lu Province, Yang Guangdou, a total of 7 provincial governors came out of the city to welcome them. In Beiliang, whether it was military or political, this was an extremely rare and high standard. As far as the city gate could see, there were more than 80 riders with swords on their backs, Su Yanbing with an iron spear in his hand, and the 2 Fu Shui Fingjia and Fan Shaochai, as well as more than 20 riders without armor or sabers. The caravan stopped outside the city gates. After the leading carriage lifted the curtain, a travel-worn young civil official jumped down. After greeting the provincial governors and generals with a smile, he turned to look at the second carriage and called out, "We've arrived." Following the line of sight of the young civil official, these Beiliang high-ranking officials who were secretly meeting in Qingsang City saw a man and a woman slowly getting off the carriage. They were not old and their appearances were not outstanding. The man was tall and had a Xianbei jade belt that was unique to the nobles of Beimang. The woman had a plump figure and there was an exquisite scented pouch on her waist that looked like lavender. It was embroidered with the pattern of a woman wearing a pipa. It was a pity that it was badly damaged. He looked at the west gate of Qingsang City with an indifferent expression. The 20 riders surrounding the carriage looked as if they were facing a great enemy. Every one of them was on high alert. Although these riders of unknown origin were unarmed and unarmed, they were veterans of hundreds of battles. They still chose to sit on the back of their horses and assumed a resolute posture, ready to charge at any time. If a rider died on the back of a horse, it would be a good death. The young man with the Xianbei jade belt on his waist said flatly in Beimang language, "Dismount." Although the riders were unwilling, they did not hesitate to dismount and land on the ground. Many of them were clearly injured, but each of them stood tall and straight. The 2 young men of similar age were both from Beimang and came from prominent backgrounds. However, their fates were completely different. The former was the grandson of the former king of Beimang's northern courtyard, Su Huainan. Now, he was visiting Su Beiji of Mount Lantuo as the deputy provincial governor of Beiliang. The latter's identity was only known from the military spy report of the provincial governor's residence. He was Xia Zhibo of Beimang, Zhong Tan, the eldest grandson of the Zhong family. He was one of the few famous generals of the new generation in Beimang's imperial court. Just like the old saying, you can escape the first time, but you can't escape the second time. Zhong Tan, who had previously broken out of the siege at the gourd mouth of Yuzhou, was successfully intercepted by Su Yanbing and the 80 Wu family sword tomb cavalry at the border of Gusai Prefecture. Then, he met up with Su Beiji at the military town of Linyao and came to Qingsang City together. When Zhong Tan identified the people at the city gate through the spider web spy report, his already heavy heart sank to the bottom. The reason why he assisted Huang Songpu in commanding the Battle of Liuzhou seemed to be the after-effect of the defeat at the Gourd Mouth battle and was abandoned by the Beimang imperial court outside of the main battlefield where he could obtain military merits. However, this time, not only did the Zhong family have high hopes for him to make a comeback, even the imperial court of Taiping also paid close attention to him. And before the Battle of Maiyunku was over, Zhong Tan was only one step away from success. Once the tens of thousands of monk soldiers from Lantuo Mountain surrendered to Beimang and cooperated with Huang Songpu's army, it meant that the situation of Liang Mang and Liang Mang in the battlefield of Liuzhou was not just a disparity in military strength, but also the fact that Beimang was the first to achieve a general trend on the battlefield. Swallowing the Longxiang army was inevitable. Moreover, to the west of Liangzhou that was supported by Qingyuan military town, and even to the entire Lingzhou that did not participate in the first battle of Liang Mang, it would be a huge deterrent. No matter how Huang Songpu's victory in Liuzhou was a Pyrrhic victory, in the end, he only needed 20 to 30,000 cavalry to invade the northwest of Lingzhou. Destroying Lingzhou meant destroying the vitality of the Beiliang frontier army, and the strategic depth of the Su family cavalry would also be greatly reduced. However, all of these became laughable ifs. Not only that, Zhong Tan also saw a group of Beiliang's top officials gathered here. Only at this moment did Zhong Tan completely confirm that Beiliang was determined to make a big move in Liuzhou. Therefore, the Battle of Mayungku was definitely not a last-minute idea of the two young Beiliang generals. Riches and honor were sought in danger, and if one succeeded, it would often be great riches and honor. Zhong Tan sighed slightly. He was the same. It was just that Zhong Tan's luck was really too terrible. Later on, when he learned that Mount Lontuo had discovered Chao Wei's cavalry, they did not watch the fire burn across the river. On the contrary, they quickly gathered 20,000 monk soldiers and rushed to the battlefield. There were even 3,000 of them who left the main army behind, almost biting the tail of Chao Wei's cavalry. Mount Lontuo could be said to be very decisive. If Zhong Tan had been given another hour, he would have been able to break through the bloody defensive line piled up by Xiaxi's corpses outside Miyun Pass. Perhaps if Chao Wei had been just a moment slower, he would have been completely entangled by the 3,000 Mount Lontuo monk soldiers. Zhong Tan really could not understand. Chao Wei was one thing. After all, he was a Beiliang general born and raised here, but why was Xiaxi willing to fight to the death for Beiliang and not retreat? Why was he even willing to give his life to Chao Wei? Zhong Tan only felt that this defeat was very unjust, but it was also not unjust at all. At this moment, Zhong Tan still did not know that his defeat to Chao Wei and Xiaxi's alliance would be praised by later historians as a glorious defeat. This was because Chao Wei and Xiaxi's alliance had steadily occupied the top 10 generals for 300 years after the auspicious talisman. Many years later, Zhong Tan would become the first person from Beimang to enter the central government of the Central Plains. He and Chao Wei would each become the left and right assistant ministers of the Ministry of War. At that time, Xiaxi's voice was very loud in the court and was most qualified to compete with Ko Jianghuai for the position of Minister of War. However, between the height of the imperial court and the distance of Jianghu, Zhong Tan chose the latter. Later generations would laugh that if Xiaxi's did not give up his official career, then the Ministry of War's Yamen could be called Miyun Pass. On the way to Qingsang City, Zhong Tan and Su Beiji, two people who belonged to different camps, one to the military and the other to the civil, had several open and honest conversations. Zhong Tan more or less knew that after becoming a prisoner, his head would not be used as a sacrifice to the Beiliang border cavalry for the time being, nor would it be directly chopped off and thrown to the other side of the gorge to add bricks and tiles to those huge temples. Zhong Tan did not believe in the saying that death was better than living. As long as one was still alive, there was hope to rise from the ashes. So along the way, Zhong Tan didn't make any small movements that brought contempt upon himself. Of course, this was also because he was well aware that unless the Northern Mang Army's god, Bodhisattva Tuoba, personally led the troops over, otherwise, with the terrifying combat strength of Su Yanbing's troops and the 80 Wu family swordsmen, even an immortal on earth would be unable to save them. Chapter 1872. At this moment, a carriage drove out of the city gate, and 3 people stepped out of the carriage. These 3 people were important figures of Beiliang, whose official positions were higher than the provincial governors and generals. Beiliang Deputy Administrator Song Dongming and Deputy Provincial Governor Yang Shenqing. There was also the King of Beiliang and Su Fengnian. After exchanging greetings with Yang Guangdou and the others, the young king came to Su Beiji and Zhong Tan. He looked at the Beimang Xia Jamo and his personal maidservant, and said in a skillful Beimang official tone, "We meet again after we parted at the Heshi provincial governor's mansion." Zhong Tan said indifferently, "If I knew Prince's identity, I would have stopped Prince." Su Fengnian shook his head and smiled, "Although my cultivation was not high at that time, even if you and this expert from the princess tomb tried to stop me, you might not have been able to stop me from escaping." Zhong Tan sneered, "Prince, don't forget, my father and uncle were nearby at that time." Su Fengnian said something inexplicable. "Let me say this first. I don't mean anything else. I've always been curious. You're called Zhong Tan, your brother's name is Zhong Gui, and your uncle's name is Zhong Liang. They all have two characters in their names. Why is your father named Zhong Shentong? Zhong Tan frowned and did not answer this question. Su Fingnian had Song Dongming, Yang Shenxing, and the provincial governors and generals go to the Liuzhou provincial governor's mansion first, while he pulled Zhong Tan and Su Beiji into the city on foot. The young king and the youngest deputy provincial governor of Liang walked side by side. Zhong Tan and his maidservant Lu Daogu followed closely behind. Zhong Tan looked at the back and asked directly, "Prince, may I ask if I am dead or alive? When will I die, and how long can I live?" Su Fingnian did not turn around. He smiled and said, "That depends on you." Zhong Tan said in a deep voice, "If your highness wants me to persuade the Zhong family to change sides before the battle, you're overestimating my influence and underestimating my Zhong family style." Su Fingnian couldn't help but stop. He turned to look at Xia Zhibo, who had a determined expression on his face, and said with a strange smile, "It's too early to say that." Zhong Tan could not figure it out, but he was too lazy to get to the bottom of it. After a moment of hesitation, he asked, "In Liuzhou, who will Beiliang use to deal with Wang Songpu's army? Who will go deep into Shijing alone?" Su Fingnian slowed his steps and walked side by side with Zhong Tan. He said frankly, "Originally, my younger brother Huang Manor and Liuzhou's general Ko Jianghuai were used to deal with Wang Songpu. Now, Xia's Mount Lantu among soldiers leading the western frontier will be added. Yuandao's Yuzhou cavalry will also be supported by Chao Wei's cavalry, and together they will enter the hinterland of your southern dynasty." Zhong Tan nodded. "In the battle in Liuzhou, Beiliang was originally barely able to fight, but now you're barely able to win. Our great situation has been ruined at the last moment." Su Fingnian smiled and said, "General Zhong is a great contributor." Zhong Tan's expression was indifferent, but his personal maid did not have this old monk's composure. She was overflowing with killing intent. Su Fingnian was unmoved. He continued, "Earlier, when I said that you spoke too early, I meant that you don't need to be anxious. If the battle outside Beiliang's pass is unfavorable, such as the loss of Beijiqing, then you, Zhong Tan, will definitely die. However, if the battle outside the pass goes beyond expectations, such as our Beiliang cavalry being able to retake Huda city next year, then you will naturally have wait." Zhong Tan said expressionlessly, "Then I'll wait and see." Su Fingnian suddenly joked, "When I went to Beimang, I had to speak in your Beimang language from beginning to end. You, Zhong Tan, are luckier than me. Now that you're in Qingsang City, you don't have to speak the language of the Central Plains." Zhong Tan dismissed it with a smile. However, the female master from the princess tomb sneered and said, "I heard that the Su family in Beiliang has a deep grudge with the Zhao family in Liang. Unexpectedly, the prince has the heart of a bodhisattva who repays evil with good. He is hell-bent on guarding the Liang emperor's house." Without waiting for Su Fingnian to speak, Zhong Tan softly shouted, "Rice." Her eyes were gloomy and her lips were tightly pursed. She was fearless and looked at the young vassal king who was a grand master of martial arts evaluation. She was unafraid of death. Su Beiji, who had been silent all this time, said, "Your words are a little hurtful. It's not very kind." Pulling Lu Daogu behind him, Zhong Tan showed an expression of admitting defeat for the first time. "Please forgive me, Your Highness." Su Fingnian glanced at the shabby brocade pouch on her waist and asked, "Have you ever drunk our Beiliang's green ant wine?" Her words were full of sarcasm. "I drank it once in my early years and I don't want to drink it again. It's very crude. However, I do want to drink the poisoned green ant wine. Your Highness, remember not to be too stingy. If one cup is not enough, give me a pot." Zhong Tan turned his head and shouted angrily, "Lu Daogu. If you want to die, don't drag me down with you." Su Fingnian withdrew his gaze from her face and continued to walk forward. That's enough. Both of you, master and servant, stop acting. One of you wants to spill your own blood and die on the spot. That way, that prince won't be angry and earn a chance to live for your master. The other wants to distance herself from her personal servant so that she won't be angered. In the end, the taste of you two is much worse than the green ant wine. After being exposed, Zhong Tan and she were speechless. Su Fengnian raised his head and looked into the distance, lost in thought. The reason he had asked the boring question about the green ant wine was that after seeing the spy and death warrior in the princess tomb, he couldn't help but think of the servant girl in Wutong in whom he had given the nickname Green Ant. Men were willing to die heroically for their country. Soldiers were willing to die for their friends. They died generously. Some women were only willing to live for men. They only wanted to dress up for those who liked them. In the end, even if they died with a tender heart. As they approached the provincial governor's mansion, Zhong Tan, Lu Daogu, and the 20 or so elite cavalrymen left under the escort of Mi Fingjie, Fan Shaochai, and a few spies from the Fu Shui chamber. Su Beiji stood on the steps outside the mansion and looked at the departing figures. He said self-deprecatingly, I originally thought of a way to tell you not to rush to kill Zhong Tan. It was all in vain. Su Fengnian smiled but didn't say anything. Su Beiji asked, what's wrong? You want to recruit this Beimang Xia Gemo, who's good at commanding troops? It doesn't seem like it. Otherwise, you would have used the tactic of treating the wise with respect. Su Fengnian shook his head and said, I'll use anyone but Zhong Tan. Su Fengnian quickly added, besides, you didn't tie him up. How am I supposed to hurry up and untie him? Su Beiji grimaced and said, you're spoiling my appetite. Su Fengnian suddenly laughed and asked, how many heads do you think Zhong Tan has? Su Beiji was stunned. He rolled his eyes and said, are you kidding? It's not funny at all. Su Fengnian looked into the distance and said softly, there are 2 cities in Yozhou's Gourd, Sleeping Bao City and Luanha City. But Zhong Tan only has 1 head on his neck. It's not enough to split. Su Beiji nodded and said, then let's keep it for now. In any case, it might be useful in the future. If Beimang is really forced into internal strife by us, Zhong Tan's Zhong family can really add fuel to the fire. Su Fengnian grunted in agreement. Su Beiji seemed to have recalled something and asked curiously, Zhong Tan aside, why didn't you kill that Beimang girl? Are you taking pity on her because she's a woman? I have to say something about you. That maid's looks are so mediocre. Can you really do it? Su Fengnian said helplessly, that's not very kind of you to say. Soon, this persimmon grabbed Zhu Zi's shoulder and said cheekily, didn't you realize that the girl was sweating profusely even though she looked like she was ready to die? Also, didn't you notice that I was emitting such a strong killing intent? I almost couldn't help but remind you, my killing intent is too strong, get out of my way. Su Beiji only replied with 1 word, scram. Su Fengnian twitched his mouth. Su Beiji retracted his expression and said softly, Zhong Tan said something very interesting. Let's wait and see. Beimang's Western Front Commander Wang Sui, Heshi Region's Magistrate Helian Wuwei, Crown Prince Yelu Hongkai, the new Assistant Minister of War Yelu Dongchuang, and some other chess pieces deeply rooted in Beimang's territory. Now, there's the Zhong family. It's really... Su Fengnian continued and said slowly, there's also Gu Jiantang and Liang, the administrator of Lihuai, Han Lin, the Prince of Jiaodong, Yang Huqin, Han Fang, and Yang Huqin. So it's really a lot of killing intent. The entire world was filled with killing intent. Chapter 1873. Because Fuyu Town at the foot of Mount Wudong was the starting point of the South Mountain Road of burning incense, and because it was rumored to be the place where Qi Jiajie's 10,000-mile sword strike ended, and because it was close to the Wudong martial arts competition, this originally unknown town suddenly became very lively. The big and small Taoist temples on Mount Wudong were already overcrowded, so many low-class rooms in Fuyu town were sold at a high price, and the restaurant business was even more profitable. Some Jianghu people who came from afar were surprised when they recognized Yuqi Liangfu, the owner of the Snow Mountain Villa, on the street, but when they entered the restaurant, they were surprised to find Zhang Chunlin, the young owner of Yuyan Mountain Villa, sitting 2 tables next to them. Then they heard that there were many fairies of Gangnam-do sitting upstairs, and then they saw Liao Dong's red sandalwood monk, one of the 16 individual immortals, striding in. The onlookers were completely numb. Normally, when they walked in Jianghu, rare grandmasters were elusive, but now, they were like cabbages on the street, it was hard not to see them. This small Fuyu town was full of crouching tigers and hidden dragons. Therefore, at this time, no matter what sect the young talents were from, or what cultivation they were from, no one dared to speak loudly. They were afraid that if they accidentally spat on the ground, it would splash on the clothes of some martial arts grandmaster, and then they would be in serious trouble. This was not an alarmist talk. Previously, the Fish Dragon Gang had sent a message to the Jianghu people that in Beiliang, it was okay to stop sparring, but they were not allowed to fight and hurt people because of personal grudges. Otherwise, if they were found, the Su family's iron cavalry would be executed without mercy. Half a week ago, there were 2 pitiful people who were unlucky. Because someone glanced at the table next to him while eating, they drew their swords and fought each other. One of them was seriously injured on the spot, while the other left in a heroic spirit. In the end, the latter was killed by the local cavalry within the time it took for an incense stick to burn. His head was hung on the street as a public display. This made people understand a principle: when traveling in Jianghu, especially Beiliang Jianghu, which had always been outside the Central Plains, one should never blindly look or act recklessly. People might die. In particular, many of the heroes of the Jianghu rushed over to join in the fun. They witnessed with their own eyes the unique pursuit of the cavalry. That famous master with extraordinary lightness skills was killed in a single charge by 200 Beiliang cavalrymen. Flying on the water or having the physique of a third-level martial artist, he had no power to fight back at all when faced with well-trained light crossbows. The Beiliang cavalrymen's frontal charge, circling around the perimeter, and intercepting them on fast horses were all done in one go. In comparison, the fight between the constables of the Central Plains and the heroes of the Jianghu was like a vixen clawing at a man in love. The difference was like heaven and earth. There was a tea stall on the side of the main road outside the small town. It was noon, and the stall was selling Wudong's famous calming cold tea. Coupled with the fragrant spring morning pancakes, business was booming. By the side of the road, there were tall horses resting with their owners. 6 or 7 greasy tables were filled with foreign tea guests. Everyone had an extraordinary air about them, and it was obvious that they were all Jianghu people who had come to Wudong for the martial arts competition. 2 of the tables were occupied by 8 young women with zither, kongho, hule, and other musical instruments placed in front of them. One of the tables was occupied by a strong young man who did not carry any weapons. His eyes shone with a bright light, and he sat majestically. With just a glance, one could tell that he was a master of external martial arts. The young men at the other table each carried a white spear on their backs. Although they were wooden spears that they practiced with every day, the 4 of them had completely different styles. They had the relatively complicated crow neck spear, the simple awl spear, the great shoe brush spear, and the donghua splitting horse spear. These 4 tables surrounded the main table, in the middle like stars surrounding the moon. There were 3 people who seemed to be of different ages sitting there. The young woman had a crystal-clear jade flute on her waist. She was graceful and moving. The man with white hair on his temples carried 2 cloth bags. The middle-aged man was short, a full head shorter than the young woman, but he had a proud look on his face. The other 2 tables were probably outsiders to these 5 tables. They were also relatively close to the road. Once a carriage passed by, dust would fly up, and it would be hard to tell whether they were drinking tea or eating dust. At this time, a carriage slowly stopped. There were 3 knights serving as the carriage's retainers. The young coachman turned around and lifted the curtain. A handsome man in white walked out of the carriage. He habitually squinted his eyes and vaguely saw the outline of escaped summer town. After whispering to each other, the man returned to the carriage. The young coachman jumped off the carriage and took the reins from one of the retainers. The retainer took over as the coachman, and the carriage continued to move towards the small town. Only one of the 3 retainers followed the young coachman. It was a young woman with a knife on her waist. Her appearance was outstanding, but unfortunately, her face was gloomy and cold. Her whiteness reduced a lot of her charm. The young man and woman who were probably servants of a big family led their horses to the tea stall. Coincidentally, there were also 2 men and women who were about the same age as them walking back from the distant river. The woman was carrying a pipa wrapped in a brocade case with western shoe pattern. Her lips were thin and her mouth was small, graceful and charming. However, the man who accompanied her was too inferior. He had a toad face that could ward off evil. He was too young and mature. When he smiled, he did not look like a Jianghu talent. He was the kind of person who would be treated as a flower thief by the guards at the city gate even if he had an identity card. When the 2 pairs of young men and women walked to the tea stall at the same time, the toad-face's small eyes rolled around and fiercely sized up the woman's retainer with a knife behind the coachman. This man who already had meat in his bowl was obviously not satisfied and was eyeing the meat in the pot. However, because of the beauty beside him, he was embarrassed to show too ugly eating manners. In the end, he did not go up to strike up a conversation. When he noticed the strange woman's cold eyes, he slightly grinned and raised his eyebrows. Then, he noticed that she was holding the handle of her knife with one hand and was about to pull it out. He was even more overjoyed. Oh, it was still a rouge horse. If it was in the past, he would have liked it the most. He could not help but stick out his tongue and lick his lips out of habit. This action provoked a sneer from the woman with the knife. The toad face did not find it strange, but the 3 people at the table in the middle almost all held their breath at the same time. It was like 2 tigers meeting on a mountain. The short man said in a deep voice, "Changfeng, come back." At the same time, the young man who had been the coachman stopped and patted the shoulder of the woman beside him. The latter immediately restrained her spirit and released her murderous aura. Chapter 1874. The toad face was full of resentment as he walked towards the table of the elders with the woman whose thin lips left a deep impression. Just then, a table near the official road was about to pay and leave. The man and woman sat down and ordered 2 bowls of calming soup. The woman with the saber lowered her voice and said, "The woman who is good at retaining her youthful looks is Lu Jijuan, the leader of the Misty Peak of the Huainan sect. She is a 2nd-grade grandmaster. I don't know why she has a deep relationship with the Qi cultivators of the northern sect. She has 2 kinds of mysterious finger supernatural powers. Now she is on good terms with the Great Snow Plateau of Mount Hui and has a good relationship with the Ministry of Justice of Liang." The man who spoke just now was called Feng Zongxi. According to the spy report of the Fu Shui chamber, this person was once defeated by the Fist Master Ye of the Martial Emperor city during the last years of Yonghui. They fought for more than 40 rounds. The people of Liang Jianghu called him the Divine Fist of the Central Plains. He was ranked alongside Fairy Fei Chan, Lu Jijuan, and the Purple Sandalwood Monk as one of the 16 rogue immortals. As for the man with the spear bag, judging from his luggage and his accompanying disciples, he is most likely one of the 12 chiefs of Auspicious Talisman, Li Zhongho. He is also one of the 4 sages. The whisk chamber did not have any records on him. He is a newly emerged martial artist of the Central Plains. Among the 3 of them, only Li Zhongho is considered to be capable. The man at the same table was none other than Su Fengnian, who had escorted Bai Yu out of Qingcang City in Liuzhou to Liuxia town. Mr. White Lotus and the white-robed monk of Liangchan Temple, Li Dongxin, had once sparred in the decennial debate between Buddhism and Taoism on Mount Longhu. Moreover, he had just received news that his good friend, Qi Xianxia, had already joined forces with Chai Qingshan of Donghua Sword Pool. Therefore, no one wanted to miss this Wudong debate. Su Fingnian, who had his back to the table, nodded and said softly, although he is much weaker than Su Yanbing, his cultivation should be about the same as Han Laoshan's. His methods are also the same. Both of them are bold and powerful. Moreover, great talents mature late. He has the chance to become a great grandmaster like Spear Immortal Wuxia. If you fight with him, your chances of winning are not high. The woman who became the manager of the second branch of the whisk chamber with me, Fingjie, said indifferently, I only know that I can definitely kill him. Su Fingnian could not help but laugh. What's there to be proud of? It's a loss of life in exchange for a life. Fan Shaochai remained silent. Su Fingnian glanced at the young man in green who occupied a table not far away. Is there no record of this person in Fu Shui room? Fan Shaochai was taken aback. He shook his head and said, no. Su Fingnian explained, Great Peace cities Qi Jiajia and Northern Mang's sword Qi were close to Huangqing, and there was also martial emperor cities Lu Huang, who gave up Dao to seek skills. When they met a mortal enemy who was on par with them, they were all covered with sword Qi. Most of the swordsmen in the world were like this. Their sword Qi was far more important than their sword will. Even if they did not show it after returning to their original state, once they made a move, they would be able to see everything clearly. Only a very few swordsmen were born with high spirits, which is the so-called natural sword embryo. For such a rare genius, as long as they were enlightened and had a little luck, they could often achieve the achievement of a sword immortal on the land. Fan Shaochai looked at the ordinary-looking young man out of the corner of his eye and frowned. Him too. Su Fingnian nodded. So many grandmasters of the sword have left over the years. Naturally, someone will rise. For example, if Gu Jiantang and Lu Xianlang of Nanjiang suddenly die, it will take about 5 or 6 years for someone to amaze the world. Fan Shaochai's expression was strange. He glanced at the young king who still had a cold saber hanging from his waist. If you, the great grandmaster of saber-wielding, died, who would you bring that torrential Guangling River's blessing and grace to? Would it be Wang Xing, Yu Dilong, and Lu Yunzhang, the 3 disciples? Or the woman surnamed Jiang who was also a sword embryo? Would it help her become an earth immortal? Su Fingnian, who had guessed her thoughts, glared at her fiercely. Fan Shaochai drank tea with one hand while the other hand under the table rubbed the hilt of the saber. Her slender hand, which had never done any household chores, was now holding the killing blood saber. Fan Shaochai suddenly asked, Are you really not going to climb the mountain? Su Fingnian, who had a slightly strange expression, shook his head. I'll pass. But if you want to join in the fun, you don't have to follow me to North Resisting City. I'll help you talk to Chu Lushan. I think you might as well go to Mount Wudong. After all, such a grand occasion may not be seen again in the future. Fan Shaochai laughed. No matter how high Mount Wudong is, it's higher than you. Su Fingnian rolled his eyes. No matter how much you flatter me, it's useless. Even if I die young, I won't pass my luck to you. Fan Shaochai laughed it off. After drinking that bowl of calming soup, she really did have a sense of calmness. Fan Shaochai suddenly tightened his grip on the hilt of his saber, his aura surging. Even the toad-faced man in the distance could feel his strong killing intent. This was Fan Shaochai's style. If she wanted to kill someone, she would always do it openly. There was no victory or defeat, only life or death. The young swordsman, whose strength she couldn't see through, stood up and walked towards them with a cup of tea. He sat down without any courtesy, facing the young lord. Su Fingnian smiled and didn't say anything. He didn't mind that the unknown swordsman had taken the liberty to disturb him. After the man sat down, his expression was solemn. He said seriously, "I didn't expect there to be a man as handsome as me in this world." "Nice to meet you." Fan Xiaochai couldn't help but twitch her mouth. She had seen shameless people before, but she had never seen such a shameless person in her life. Then the man turned to stare at Fan Xiaochai. "Miss, your saber is good, and your saber skills are even better. Unfortunately, your saber power is not satisfactory." Fan Xiaochai smiled. "Oh." The man raised the teacup in his hand like a private school teacher. He said methodically, "In my hometown, there is a blue and white porcelain cup that is popular with the ladies of noble families. When held in the hand, the slightly slanted edge of the cup is pressed against the edge of the hand. The cup's size and weight are just right, and it fits the hand well. Therefore, it is known to be a pressure cup. Whether it's tea or wine, it can be pressed against a woman's body. On the other hand, your innate physique is not outstanding. You only relied on your family's teachings and the foundation of your sect to achieve your current level of cultivation. But in the long run, it will inevitably harm your body. You must know that momentum are the most important things. Your cultivation, however, is the opposite. It's like a woman with a mediocre capacity pretending to be bold and drinking from a big bowl. It's not a long-term solution." Fan Xiaochai said flatly, "Are you my father?" The man thought for a moment and said calmly, "Of course not, but I can be your husband." Su Fengnian, who drank tea much slower than Fan Xiaochai, almost spat out the tea in his mouth when he heard this. Fan Xiaochai smiled slightly, as if she was not angry at this lecher's licentious words. But her saber was already unsheathed. The man had been holding the cup in his right hand and resting his left hand on his knee under the table. At this moment, he suddenly raised his left hand high. It was clearly a casual and ordinary movement, but it made the head of the Whispering Room's assassins, who were numb to killing, feel their scalps go numb. They felt as if they were hallucinating. When the saber was unsheathed, it meant death. Chapter 1875. Fan Xiaochai's saber-wielding hand trembled slightly. Even against Mi Fingjie, who was superior in both martial cultivation and experience, Fan Xiaochai had never felt such fear. More importantly, she had never feared death. The young swordsman did not take advantage of the situation to attack. He only turned to the owner of the tea stall and shouted, "Add 3 bowls of calming soup." Su Fengnian smiled. "Impressive." Su Fengnian said to Fan Xiaochai, "Don't be nervous. This young master has no ill intentions." Fan Xiaochai's face was pale, her eyes gloomy. When the owner of the tea stall placed the 3 bowls of calming soup on the table, the man nodded. "Of course I have no ill intentions. Ever since I entered the Jianghu, I've always thought that I would become a divine couple with that Xianyuan Zi of Mount Hui's great snow plains. But after seeing this young lady, I feel that she will definitely miss out on a good match like me." Su Fengnian had to repeat, "Impressive." The man then turned to Fan Xiaochai and said considerately, "It's fine if you want to kill me, but it's best if you drink the tea and find a secluded and spacious place. When the time comes, I won't retaliate and will let you attack me." Fan Xiaochai took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the hilt of her saber tightly. She gnashed her teeth. "Are you courting death?" The man gave an unexpected answer. His expression was incomparably serious. "I'm looking for you." Fan Xiaochai's eyes were filled with the determination to face death. She pulled out her saber without a care for anything else. Just as the tip of her saber was about to be completely exposed, her aura reached its peak. The young swordsman, who had been expressionless all this time, smiled for the first time. He leaned slightly forward towards Fan Xiaochai and pointed 2 fingers of his left hand at the space between Fan Xiaochai's eyebrows, stopping just an inch away from her. There was a great deal of meaning in this movement. Fan Shaochai quickly leaned back in an attempt to avoid the attack. But the man released his fingers and gently pressed his palm on her shoulder. Shocking crimson blood seeped out of the corner of Fan Shaochai's mouth. Su Fengnian narrowed his eyes. This move of his was truly impressive. It wasn't because of the amazement of his moves or his aura, but because of the depth of his intentions. Fan Shaochai raised his arm and casually wiped away the blood. The young swordsman was still holding her shoulder. He stopped smiling and said earnestly, "Miss, when it comes to imposing manner, righteousness is the same as evil and evil. The difference is that the former is like this post road where several riders can walk side by side. The latter is like a single plank bridge where there is only enough space to stand on. It is not easy to turn around. People's depression is heavy and it is hard to get rid of it. Why is there a saying that the people of the world have to speak their mind? That was the logic. Our martial arts cultivation, whether it's the saber, the sword, or the fist technique, is a long-term thing. How can you reach the top in one go? Even if you're an immortal on Earth, you still need to take a breath of fresh air when fighting to the death." Fan Shaochai's lips were tightly shut. In fact, at this moment, her mouth was already full of blood, and she couldn't even say the word "scram." But she still didn't want to spit it out. If Su Fengnian, the king of Beiliang, was the person she wanted to kill the most in her life, then this fellow who had been kicked in the head more than once by a donkey was second. He had already surpassed Chu Lushan, who had personally turned her into a death warrior of the Fu Shui room years ago. Su Fengnian sighed and raised the bowl of calming soup that had just been delivered. He poured half of it into the empty bowl before handing it to Fan Shaochai. She hesitated for a moment before taking the white bowl. She shook off the man's hand on her shoulder and turned around. Lowering her head, she spat blood into the bowl and drank it all in one gulp. Perhaps apart from Su Fengnian, only the Snow House Spear Saintly Hongho of the Jianghu people around the table had figured out the mystery. Even in the eyes of Lu Jijuan of Ethereal Peak and Feng Zongxi, the master of fist techniques, there was nothing special about the young swordsman other than his speed. And that speed seemed to be all there was to it. As for the others, they were even more confused. That young swordsman looked at Fan Shaochai's back, wanting to say something but hesitating. In the end, he didn't say anything. He turned to Su Fengnian and asked, "You are either an ordinary person who has never practiced martial arts or a top figure who is skilled in qi cultivation. Otherwise, I would have been able to sense the uniqueness of your qi flow. But since you have the guts to walk around the city with a cold saber hanging around your waist, and you have this girl with you, I believe that you are not simple." Then Su Fengnian waited quietly for him to continue. But this time, the young swordsman didn't disappoint. "Then may I ask for this girl's name?" Su Fengnian smiled and said, "She used to be called Fan Shaochai, as in hairpin. Now, she is called Fan Shaochai, as in firewood." That person nodded and said, "As I expected, they are both good names." Su Fengnian was speechless. After roaming the Jianghu for so many years, had he finally met an opponent whose skin was as thick as his? It was just that when he was at his lowest point in the Jianghu back then, other than his face, he still relied on his face to beg for water from the village women. He was invincible and had never been defeated. However, the person in front of him purely relied on his face. That person thought for a moment. "Forget it. I wanted to ask you something, but there's no need for that now. In any case, it doesn't matter whether I go to Mount Wudong or not." Su Fengnian, who already knew the young swordsman's identity, asked with a smile, "Why doesn't it matter? Are you really not going to compete with that king of Beiliang?" The young swordsman was astonished. "You know who I am." Su Fengnian nodded. He rubbed his chin and said in realization, "It's not easy for you to guess my identity just from my appearance. But then again, it's also reasonable." Su Fengnian began to understand Fan Shaochai's feelings a little. Fan Shaochai had already turned around and placed the white bowl on the table. He stared at that person and said, "I must kill you." That person was neither mocking nor angry. He grinned brightly and said, "As you wish." Su Fengnian asked curiously, "You're not joking?" That person sat up straight and said in a deep voice, "I never joke with people. If I really like someone, shouldn't it be love at first sight? I don't think that falling in love with someone is the only way to do so. Instead, it's only after falling in love with someone that we'll be able to do so." "What, you don't believe me?" Su Fengnian looked at this young face in a daze. He thought of the old man in the sheepskin coat and that green-robed Fengdu cultivator. It turned out that there were still fools in the Jianghu. They were unreasonable and did not need to be reasoned with. Su Fengnian smiled and said softly, "I believe you." Fan Shaochai asked expressionlessly, "Who are you?" Su Fengnian couldn't help but rub his brows. As expected, this fellow was starting to hurt him invisibly again. "Miss Shaochai, I like you. It has nothing to do with whether you like me or not." Then he winked at Fan Shaochai. "Don't be surprised if I don't like you one day." Fan Shaochai was on the verge of breaking down. He roared, "Who are you?" Only then did the young swordsman put his hand on the hilt of his sword. He looked at her with clear eyes and smiled. "Taibai Sword Sect, Qin Tianyuan." He paused for a moment and then said loudly, "So. The only time I don't like you is when Qin Tianyuan's sword is broken." The young men and women at the nearby tables who were drinking tea or chewing biscuits all spat out their mouths. Taibai Sword Sect, banished Immortal Qin Tianyuan. In the 100 years of Jianghu, Qin Tianyuan was still the most talented swordsman after the spring and autumn sword armor Li Chungang. He was the fastest to break through. Lu Jiejuan and Feng Zongxi looked at the snow hut spear Saint Li Chungho at the same time. The latter nodded slightly. He should be the one from Taibai Sword Sect. The toad-faced beauty and the thin-lipped beauty sitting at the same table as the three seniors looked at each other. Didn't they say that the banished immortal of Taibai Sword Sect was famous for his white clothes, white horse, and white sword when he first appeared in Jianghu? Didn't they say that the banished immortal was as handsome as a celestial immortal? Su Fengnian slowly raised his teacup. He wasn't in a hurry to drink the tea. He looked into the distance and was lost in thought. This person's current scene. The scene when he left. There was once an old man who liked to pick his feet and said angrily, "What old sword god?" "It's the sword god." There was once a wooden sword ranger who was so poor that he didn't even make a sound. He said heroically, "If a peerless swordsman with the surname Wen appears in Jianghu one day, there's no doubt that it's me." Some people were no longer in this world. Some people were no longer in Jianghu. Some people were still in front of him. After Su Fengnian came back to his senses, he put down his teacup and shouted to the trembling shopkeeper of the tea stall, "Do you have any green and wine? Give me 2 pots." Now that Beiliang's jurisdiction had banned the brewing of wine, the newly brewed green and wine was destined not to be available in the taverns and restaurants of all sizes. Most of the wine was stored in the cellars of previous years. This tea stall had to do business with foreign Jianghu people. After all, a bowl of calming soup only cost a few coins, which was far easier to make money by selling wine. Therefore, the shopkeeper specially bought some relatively coarse-aged green and wine. There were 4 or 5 pots left, so he brought 2 pots to this table. The price of 1 pot now was about the price of 4 pots of green and wine a few years ago. Fortunately, Beiliang didn't have the habit of diluting water. Green and wine was good and bad, but they were all authentic. As the Jianghu people of the Central Plains swarmed to Mount Wudong, someone shouted, "If you don't drink green and wine, you've come to Beiliang for nothing." Qin Tianyuan asked, "You're treating?" Su Fengnian nodded and said, "You treat me to calming soup, and I treat you to green and wine in return. What's wrong with that?" Chen Tianyuan said seriously, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that I don't drink wine. Su Fengnian said in surprise, there's a swordsman in the world who doesn't drink wine. Chen Tianyuan pointed at himself and said matter-of-factly, I'm one. Su Fengnian looked at the 2 pots of green ant wine on the table and felt a little embarrassed. Chapter 1876. Other than Su Fengnian and Chen Tianyuan's table, the ones with the most complicated feelings were the frog-faced, thin-lipped girl and the other arrogant young people. If they were in Liang province, they would undoubtedly be the most outstanding. But they were afraid of comparison, just like the cold beauty with the pipa on her back. No matter how many followers she had in Huainan Jianghu, when she really walked into the bigger Jianghu and was lucky enough to come in contact with the top martial artists of level 1-4 realms, these heavenly scenery, she would feel guilty. When the young banished immortal of Taibai sword school was far away, as Jianghu disciples who were about the same age as him, they were amazed, doubtful, and more envious. Now that he was in front of them, they had mixed feelings and felt that he was unattainable. It was inevitable that they felt ashamed of their inferiority, but they also hoped to talk to him. They knew that they relied more on their sect and their master to walk in Jianghu, but Chen Tianyuan was different. It was said that there was a person in Beimang who had a sect. Then Chen Tianyuan, who broke through level 2, Vidra and Finger Xian in a short year, was not much inferior. This young swordsman who left his peers in the dust was qualified to be on the same level as their backer. As for his future, it was even more immeasurable. Among the 4 masters of the Liang River Lake, there was no doubt that Chen Tianyuan's future was the highest. How high was it? Maybe Chen Tianyuan was as high as Sword Armor Li Chungang and Su Fengnian. The frog-faced girl whispered to Feng Zongxi, whose nickname was well known, Master, this young man of Taibai sword school, has his martial cultivation really entered the Finger Xian realm? The short but unique fist master nodded and said, it should be true. The thin-lipped girl's eyes were shining. How could she not know that the ordinary-looking man in green, who was unwilling to take a second look after glancing at him, was the future leader of Jianghu in the world in her mind? The difference was big, but the surprise was also big. Although Chen Tianyuan wasn't the second Li Chungang in the rumors, and at the very least, he didn't look like a romantic and elegant person, as long as his talent in swordsmanship wasn't overstated, it was enough for her to willingly rely on him. Feng Zongxi chuckled softly and said, Chang Feng, I'll take this opportunity to tell you a secret. Do you know why those who reach the top of the world sword principle can often become the number 1 person in the world of Jianghu? Do Chang Feng grinned and said, Master, please speak, disciple is listening. Feng Zongxi slowly said, there are tens of thousands of people who practice martial arts. Putting aside the people of the 3 sects, the swordsmen in the world pay the most attention to destiny. Their decline is another's rise, and they all strive to outshine others. At the end of the day, how can I allow others to snore beside my bed? Do Chang Feng seemed to understand. The thin-lipped woman sitting beside Lu Jijuan of the ethereal peak asked gently, is it just like the number of land immortals? There's a fixed number. Lu Jijuan, who had the occult finger technique, nodded with a smile. Do Chang Feng nodded and said, that's similar to the officialdom. There are 6 ministers, 6 positions, and everyone has their own position. The spear sage of the snow house with white hair lowered his head and sipped his tea. The corners of his mouth twitched, full of disdain. Do Chang Feng asked carefully, Master, can I go sit at the table of the banished immortal? I'll just take it as a chance to get some immortal qi. Feng Zongxi nodded. The toad-faced man trotted over and said enthusiastically, I'm Do Chang Feng, may I? Chen Tianyuan did not pay any attention to the new top 10 young masters of Liang Jianghu. He turned his head and looked directly at Feng Zongxi. He had seen Fan Shaochai at almost the same time as the man surnamed Do. Chen Tianyuan remembered Do Chang Feng's face clearly. Feng Zongxi, the Grand Master of Taekwondo, who was also in the front row of the great snow square with Lu Jijuan of the ethereal peak, was a little displeased with this young man who had been in the limelight for a while. However, his expression remained the same. He did not follow Chen Tianyuan's instructions and ask his disciple, Dou Changfeng, to return to his seat. Dou Changfeng's talent was average and his temper was even worse. Since Feng Zongxi was able to reach his current level of martial arts and had to deal with people from all walks of life, he naturally had a discerning eye. However, Dou Changfeng was the son of an aristocratic family with a prominent background. He was not the eldest son of the first wife, and his family's worshipper was a grandmaster who had retired from Jianghu and lived in seclusion. Feng Zongxi was indebted to him in the early years, so Dou Changfeng became the proud disciple of the Central Plains Divine Fist Master. Moreover, Feng Zongxi was a man of Jianghu and valued his reputation the most. He was a man of honor and would only accept a toast and not a forfeit. Although Chen Tianyuan had a great reputation and was known as one of the 4 young grandmasters of the new martial arts evaluation, Feng Zongxi was not afraid of this young banished immortal whose sect was far away from the Central Plains. At the very least, he had Lu Jijuan, whose sect was deeply intertwined, and Li Zhongho, who could only die under the great snow cone spear. Therefore, Feng Zongxi would not lower himself to show weakness to a young man. If word got out, he would not be able to survive in Jianghu. Dou Changfeng, who had a toad-like face with his master's support, immediately made up his mind. Since he could not win over this genius swordsman of the Tai-Bai sword sect, he would take advantage of this opportunity to destroy a guy whose reputation in Jianghu was even higher than his. Chen Tianyuan, who was dressed in a green robe, slowly stood up and said calmly, "From today onwards, my sword will be renamed Firewood." Obviously, this sentence was only for Fan Shaochai. Su Fengnian held back his laughter and glanced at her. Fan Shaochai seemed to be completely indifferent. Chapter 1877. Feng Zongxi frowned. If it was an unwritten rule in the Chinese world of Jianghu, if there was not a great disparity in strength between the two parties involved in a conflict and both parties knew each other well, they would definitely sit down and talk. It was also fine if they did not sit down. Even if they still had to fight in the end, they would still stand and talk first. He did not expect that this rising star did not understand the etiquette at all. Dou Changfeng wanted to see the world in chaos. He fanned the flames and said, "Young Master Qin, I don't mean anything else. Why won't you give me face? Fine, even if you don't want to know me, I'll take it as my unrequited love. But my master, the leader of the Snow Hut sect, and Fairy Facian are all here. Why do you have to say the name of your sword and be so aggressive?" Chen Tianyuan, who had his back to Fan Shaochai, said softly, "Don't worry, I won't lose." Su Fengnian could not help but laugh. "Don't you know that Fan Shaochai wants you to be hacked to death?" After the young man who held up an entire sect by himself said this, his aura changed completely. He did not even hold the hilt of his sword. There was no sword aura around him. But his sword aura was soaring. 3 feet above his waist. Like a river. Su Fengnian looked up in the direction of the great lotus peak of Wudong Mountain. He felt a headache coming on. At this moment, Feng Zongxi's expression finally changed. He thought that he had overestimated this sword Dao banished immortal, but now he knew that he had underestimated him. Even Lu Jijuan of the Misty Peak, who was in her 50s but looked like she was 18, had to stand up and act as a mediator. She said in a hoarse voice, "Young Master Qin, it's fate that we met by chance. Why do you have to fight?" Chen Tianyuan said in a low voice, "I have the reason. The sword is at my waist." Lu Jijuan smiled bitterly and said nothing. Young people really did not know the depth of the Jianghu. So what if you defeated this Central Plains Divine Fist? Feng Zongxi had worked hard in the Liang River Lake for 30 years before he managed to accumulate his current reputation. It could be said that he had friends all over the country, especially the great steward of the great snow plains, Huang Fangfua. Since Tai Bai's sword clan had already become one of the 10 great sects, they would definitely be involved with the Chinese plains in the future. Tai Bai's sword clan, which was located in a corner of the world, did not have any geographical advantage. Once they became enemies with Feng Zongxi, they would not have to worry about the sects of the Chinese plains, the local government, or even the Ministry of Justice in Great Peace City harboring prejudice against Tai Bai's sword clan. It was unknown if Qin Tianyuan, who gave people the impression that he was simple-minded, suddenly had a flash of inspiration or something else. This time, he actually went straight to the heart of the people and said, "Since my Tai Bai sword sect is a sword sect, we should stand on the sword. Raise your sword and flatten the hills and ravines, only aim straight for the center." Su Fingnian took a big gulp of wine and smiled. Well said. Just as Feng Zongxi and Lu Jijuan were hesitating, the solemn snow house spear Saint Li Chongho had already taken off his 2 large and small spear pouches and said indifferently, "The spear is called the Great Snow Cone." Su Fingnian suddenly said to Fan Shaochai in a hurry, "I have to go first. Help me keep an eye on this guy. If you need to, then act. Of course, I'm not asking you to kill him, I'm asking you to help him. If you really can't do it, then tell me your identity." Su Fingnian had just stood up and was about to leave when a clear voice came from far above everyone's heads. "Su." Su Fingnian had a bitter expression and muttered, "It doesn't make sense. How can you see me from so far away?" Princess Sui Zhu Zhao Fingya, who had already suddenly died of illness, just so happened to be on Mount Wudong, and the little mud man was also there. Even more coincidentally, these 2 princesses had been at loggerheads on the mountain in their early years. Su Fingnian could never have imagined that after entering Beiliang, Zhao Fingya had steeled her heart to live in seclusion on Mount Wudong. Nor could he have imagined that the little mud man was even more determined to take care of the vegetable garden on the mountain. Su Fingnian didn't think that the 2 of them would empathize with each other and would be thanking the gods if they didn't fight. Qin Tianyuan leaned to the side and raised his head. For the first time, he grasped the firewood originally named Careless. He was a natural sword embryo that only appeared once in 100 years. That one was even more so. In Jianghu, when it encountered a great year that only appeared once in 1,000 years, it became unreasonable. Everyone looked up at the sky at the same time. A woman was flying through the air with a box on her back. She broke through the vast sea of clouds from Big Lotus Peak and flew over like an immortal descending to the mortal world. The old people always said that in Jianghu, one had to pay attention to style. With her style, she probably couldn't be any more impressive. A sword immortal of the land, flying 1,000 miles on her sword, traveling to Kunlun in the morning and arriving at the Eastern Sea in the evening. However, this female sword immortal's actions after landing in front of everyone's dumbfounded eyes were even more shocking. She didn't continue to ride her sword back into the box like an immortal. Instead, she held the great Liang Dragon Sparrow sword and pointed the tip of the sword at a guy who was forcing a smile. She said angrily, trying to run. The guy sat back down on the bench and said confidently, "How is that possible? I was just thinking of bringing you a bottle of green ant wine." She widened her eyes. He stared back at her without showing any signs of fear. Her face was flushed red and she was fuming. They stared at each other. There was a large group of people beside them who were also staring with their eyes wide open. Finally, she glanced at the unopened bottle of green ant wine on the table and said with a straight face, "You can pay the bill yourself." Su Fingnian said with a cheeky smile, "I know that you like to bring money with you when you go out. Lend it to me first and I'll return it to you later." Seeing that she was about to raise her sword and slash him, Su Fingnian immediately lowered his head and took out a money bag. I clearly remember that I didn't bring any money." Qin Tianyuan saw this scene and felt that this person was really shameless. She snorted heavily and flew back on her sword. She came from the sky and left from the sky. He didn't forget to remind her loudly, "Slow down, the wind is strong." When her figure disappeared into the surging sea of clouds, everyone turned to look at that spineless guy. He slammed the table and said angrily, "What? Is it wrong for a man to love his wife?" Chapter 1878. Jiang Ni's trip back and forth on the sword undoubtedly gave Feng Zongxi and the others a way out. After witnessing the sword style of the young banished immortal, they no longer had the mood to exchange pointers. Feng Zongxi admitted that if they fought in pairs, he would definitely lose to Qin Tianyuan, the rising star of Jianghu. If he joined forces with Lu Jijuan, it would only become a joke. The two of them had lived for more than 90 years. How could they join forces to bully a young junior who had not even reached 30 years of age? If they lost, they would lose their integrity. If they won, it would be dishonorable. It was not worth it. Even the Snow House spear sage Li Hongho, who had already announced the name of the Great Snow Cone, hesitated for a moment. After glancing at Su Fengnian, he put away the famous spear that was as famous as Wang Xiu's, Cha Na, and Chen Jibao's, plum wine. This grandmaster, who was regarded as extremely powerful in Jianghu of the Central Plains, was originally known for his violent character. However, compared to Feng Zongxi and Lu Jijuan, these two friends, who were more timid the older they got in Jianghu, Li Hongho had an inexplicable intuition. He was actually not afraid of Qin Tianyuan, who was unparalleled in Jianghu. On the contrary, he was more interested in the young master with the saber who had an average reputation. After entering the mysterious finger realm, one's heart would be connected. One would be able to predict the future. As for Li Hongho, he was a pure martial artist with a body of Vajra. His mysterious finger realm was solid and steady. He took one step at a time. He was the same as the Beiliang sword grandmaster Mi Fingjie, who was not well known in Jianghu. He was far better at predicting the enemy's moves than the Taoist immortals. Chen Tianyuan saw that the Snow House spear sage did not have the intention to fight to the death, so he sat back down. His mind was more focused on the woman who was riding the sword. He asked doubtfully, when did Mount Wudong have a female sword immortal who lived in seclusion? Of course, Su Fengnian wouldn't answer this question. There was no need for him to talk too much with a mere acquaintance. Admiring this young banished immortal was one thing, and dealing with him was another. Su Fengnian put away the money pouch, picked up a pot of green ant wine, and threw a look at Fan Shaochai. The latter quietly took out a piece of silver and placed it on the table, ready to follow Su Fengnian up the mountain. The two of them walked towards the two mounts together. Because they were the superior Beiliang warhorses from the Qianli ranch, they did not need to be tied up, nor would they get lost, let alone be ridden by strangers. Qin Tianyuan hesitated for a moment. Just as he was about to say that they should go together, Fan Shaochai turned his head and shot him a cold glance. The young swordsman, who was confident that he could take on 3 legendary Jianghu figures alone, immediately felt a little discouraged. He sat where he was and drank a mouthful of calming spirit soup, but it was tasteless. Suddenly, someone riding a donkey leisurely came along the post road. Compared to the majestic and dense sound of horse hooves, the sound of the donkey's hooves was somewhat soft and comical. Su Fengnian was stunned for a moment. He looked at the middle-aged man riding the donkey with a complicated expression. Fan Shaochai did not know the middle-aged man, but she guessed the identity of the swordsman from the clues on the young lord's face. He rode a donkey, had a sword at his waist, and was able to make Su Fengnian stop and wait. The only swordsman in the world. Unexpectedly, when Qin Tianyuan saw the middle-aged swordsman, his expressionless face blossomed into a look of pleasant surprise. He suddenly stood up and strode forward, before Su Fengnian and Fan Shaochai. He was extremely excited and said in a trembling voice, "Greetings, master." The middle-aged man jumped off the donkey and said helplessly, "How many times have I told you, I am not your master, and I only have one disciple." Qin Tianyuan smiled brightly and said, "Whether or not you recognize me as your disciple is your business. Whether or not I recognize you as my master is my business, Qin Tianyuan. The middle-aged man said in a bad mood, fortunately, your swordsmanship can be considered a small success. Otherwise, with your stubborn temperament, you would have been beaten until your parents can't recognize you. He led the donkey to Su Fengnian, sized him up, and asked curiously, isn't it just a Hong Jingyan? Why is he so miserable? Su Fengnian said softly, it's already lucky that he didn't die from Bodhisattva to Oba's all-out punch. Later on, Chen Jibao found me at Huaiyang Pass and we had a fight, which slightly delayed my cultivation of qi. The middle-aged man suddenly understood and said, oh. This time, it was the arrogant Chen Tianyuan's turn to be stunned. Hong Jingyan, to Oba, and now Chen Jibao. Su Fengnian thought for a while and decided not to climb the mountain. He led the middle-aged man back to the tea stall and glanced at the sword at his waist. He asked with a smile, the first time was outside Wuwu City in the East Sea, the second time was in Dunhuang City in Beimang, and the last time was in Tai'an City. I've seen you 3 times, but I've never seen you with a sword. What happened this time? Dong Tai said seriously, it's autumn, where can I get peach blossoms? Don't tell me there are still peach blossoms blooming in Beiliang. Su Fengnian sighed. Whether it was the peach blossom sword deity or the banished deity Qin Tianyuan, why did these swordsmen always like to tell such unfunny jokes? Dong Tai patted the sword at his waist and said with a smile, this is a gift from my disciple to his master. What do you think? Su Fengnian glanced at the ordinary sword and could only say, the gift is light, but the thought is heavy. Dong Tai shook his head and said, it's 20 taels of silver. It's not light. Su Fengnian smiled and said, the Tide Listening Pavilion actually has a few good swords. If you want a newly forged sword, I have some relations with the Yuyan Mountain Villa. Right now, the Dragon Cliff Sword Furnace and the Water Dragon Chant Furnace are also forging swords. Dong Tai waved his hand and interrupted Su Fengnian's good intentions. What do I want those swords for? Su Fengnian said with a smile, I know you definitely don't want them, but I still have to say these words. Dong Tai sneered and said, you really are Su Zhao's son. It's a pity that you take after Wu Su's appearance. Su Fengnian was somewhat resentful. After sitting down, he asked, do you want to drink wine or tea? Dong Tai could drink wine, but he didn't like it. As for tea, he found it even more boring. Since he had come to Beiliang, he did as the Romans did and ordered a pot of green ant wine. When Dong Tai opened the seal, he glanced at Qin Tianyuan and asked casually, what's with this appearance? Qin Tianyuan smiled and extended 2 fingers. He gently pulled off the flawless root-like skin, revealing an extremely handsome face. It was not inferior to West Chu's Song Yushu, nor to Beiliang's Yuan Dao. Su Fengnian finally understood why this guy appreciated him after seeing him. It wasn't just because he was thick-skinned. Su Fengnian asked, there's a rumor in Jianghu that you taught him swordsmanship. I didn't believe it at first. Dong Tai said indifferently, it can't be considered teaching swordsmanship. After Li Chungang borrowed my sword, I returned from Beimang and happened to see this person comprehending swordsmanship on a mountaintop in Nanzhao. I gave him a few pointers. Later, after returning from a visit to the Immortals in the East Sea, I came ashore from the Guanyin sect in the South Sea and met him again. Su Fengnian looked deeply at Qin Tianyuan and sighed, no wonder. No wonder Qin Tianyuan could make rapid progress on the path of the sword. Li Chungang didn't want to ascend. After his death, he carried the fate of the path of the sword and naturally scattered to the mortal world. Because the little mud man had the fate of the West Chu dynasty, he couldn't inherit the fate of the Jianghu old man. Presumably, the lucky one was Qin Tianyuan, whom Dong Tai found. Therefore, Su Fengnian blurted out, Qin Tianyuan, do you want to learn the 2-sleeved green snake and the sword opening the gate of heaven? Qin Tianyuan frowned and shook his head. Why should I learn it? Su Fengnian asked in a low voice, "You dare not learn it?" Chen Tianyuan retorted, "Why wouldn't I dare? So what if it's Li Chuangong's famous supreme art? So what if you're Su Fengnian?" Fan Shaochai was somewhat puzzled. In his impression, although this young vassal king was shrewd, he wasn't some wanton, arrogant, and despotic person. As for that banished immortal of the Tai-Bai sword sect, no matter what he did, Fan Shaochai wouldn't be surprised in the slightest. But even after seeing Chen Tianyuan's true self, Fan Shaochai still didn't like him from the bottom of his heart. It could even be said that he hated him even more. "You don't need a reason to like me. I don't like you for all kinds of reasons. Love in the world has been bitter since ancient times." Su Fengnian and Chen Tianyuan were at daggers drawn. The latter's sword intent surged like the rising sun, making the tables of people who had thought they would settle things peacefully feel as if they were facing a great enemy. Chen Tianyuan said seriously, "I came to Beiliang to fight you." Dong Tai, who had always stayed out of the affairs of Jianghu, spoke for the first time. "If you can't back down in a fight to the death, then draw your sword." "Why draw your sword in a meaningless fight where you're sure to lose?" Chen Tianyuan gripped the hilt of his sword, his expression cold. "He was the one who forced my hand first." Su Fengnian exhaled softly and said mockingly, "If you don't want to learn, then don't. I reckon someone like you won't be able to learn the old man's two-sleeved green snake even if you wanted to." Chen Tianyuan sneered, "There's no sword move in the world that I, Chen Tianyuan, can't learn." Su Fengnian turned to Fan Shaochai. "Don't you think this guy has a face that deserves a beating?" Fan Shaochai nodded. But she added with great disrespect, "Just like a certain someone." Chapter 1879. Chen Tianyuan felt gratified. Women were indeed more loyal to him. Su Fengnian ignored Fan Shaochai's defiant words and glanced at Chen Tianyuan. "You're so ugly. You're far worse than Li Chungang." Chen Tianyuan sneered. "You're the same." Su Fengnian took a sip of wine and said proudly, "Who's the same as you? Do you have a legitimate wife, Chen Tianyuan?" Chen Tianyuan looked at Fan Shaochai, who was so close but seemed so far away. He looked at the young vassal king and felt a little depressed. For the first time in his life, he wanted to drink to drown his sorrows. Dong Tai poured some green and wine into his palm and turned around. The old donkey immediately came over and licked the wine. Su Fengnian asked, "Why are you in Beiliang?" Su Fengnian did not think that a Wudang martial art discussion would be able to make this peach blossom sword deity, who was detached from worldly affairs, rush over after hearing the news. Dong Tai said calmly, "I don't care how Liang and Bei Mang fight. I don't even care how Liang Mang fights to the death." Su Fengnian waited for a long time, but Dong Tai did not give an answer. Dong Tai finally realized that the young vassal king was waiting for him to speak. He clicked his tongue and said, "This green ant wine is really strong. Let me take a break." Then Su Fengnian and Dong Tai raised their heads at the same time, but they raised their heads in opposite directions. In the direction of Escape Summer Town were Chai Ching Shan of the Donghua Sword Pool and Qi Xianxia of the Dragon Tiger Mountain. At that time, the two grandmasters had secretly gone up the mountain together and temporarily stayed in the newly opened Qingshan Taoist Temple of Wudang. They were not as eye-catching as many Jianghu bigwigs. On the east side of the road, there was a carriage. The old coachman carried a long sword on his back instead of a sword at his waist. Chai Qingshan and Qi Xianxia came together and were quickly recognized by Feng Zongxi and Lu Jijuan. Especially Feng Zongxi, who had visited the Donghua Sword Pool many times and was familiar with the previous sect master, Song Nianqing. However, when facing Song Nianqing, Feng Zongxi, who was only 40 years old, naturally regarded himself as a junior. After Chai Qingshan entered the Donghua Sword Pool from the Spring Snow Building's head guest elder, Feng Zongxi was one of the first guests. He had to address Chai Ching-shan as Mr. and was extremely respectful towards this former #1 expert in the southeast of Liang. Lu Jijuan recognized Chai Ching-shan because of the deep relationship between the Misty Peak and the Ministry of Justice. When Chao Chongqing attacked Great Peace City, Lu Jijuan should have fought side by side with Chai Ching-shan. It was only because of his closed-door training that he missed the soul-stirring event. However, Lu Jijuan had been spreading the word in the Jianghu that the Dongyue sword pool was superior to the Wu family sword tomb in terms of both its heritage and the way of the sword. Therefore, when Chai Ching-shan appeared, Feng Zongxi and Lu Jijuan quickly stood up with respectful expressions. Dou Changfeng and the other disciples of the Misty Peak did not dare to sit down, just like the officials of the local government meeting the Purple Emperor. Chai Ching-shan was not the kind of martial arts master who kept people at arm's length. In the face of Feng and Lu's eagerness, he greeted them politely and introduced Qi Xianxia, who was his friend despite their age difference. Qi Xianxia's expression was warm and genial. He was originally waiting at the foot of the mountain for Mr. White Lotus, who was also from the Dragon and Tiger sect. He only came here with Chai Ching-shan after sensing the dense sword aura. At this moment, the 4 Grand Masters of the martial arts evaluation included Su Fengnian and Dong Tai. The 4 Grand Masters of the new martial arts evaluation also included Chen Tianyuan and Qi Xianxia. At the same time, the masters of the Dongyue sword pool and the Wu family sword tomb had also arrived. Chai Ching-shan, Wu Jian. The carriage stopped at the side of the road and Wu Jian got off slowly. Dong Tai, who had his back to the old man, snorted. He was the peach blossom sword god who appeared out of nowhere, but he did not like the sword tomb at all. In the 100 years of Jianghu, only 3 people were able to walk out of the Wu family sword tomb. The first was Li Chungang, who swaggered away with the wooden bowl. Then, the previous generation's sword crown, Wu Su, broke off all ties with the Wu family. Finally, Dong Tai left with an invincible aura. The old man sat on the bench next to Su Fengnian and said with a smile, "Little Tai Yi, how many years has it been since we last met?" Dong Tai lowered his head and drank with a straight face. He was unwilling to talk. Su Fengnian looked at this elder from his mother's family. He wanted to say something but hesitated. He felt strange. The old man stretched out his withered hand and patted the back of Su Fengnian's hand. Then, he smiled amiably at Dong Tai and said, "We were born in different ancestral halls. Indeed, the Wu family has wronged you first. When you left home, you said that you would never share the same grave. Do you really want to do that?" Dong Tai sneered and said, "What, does the Wu family's sword tomb need an outsider with the surname Deng to hold up its face?" The old man chuckled and said, "If you are willing to acknowledge your ancestors, that is also possible." Dong Tai was on the verge of swearing. Fortunately, he swallowed it back down and took a big gulp of wine. The old man's eyes seemed to be in a trance. At the peak of the Wu family sword mountain, there were once 4 swords: Wooden Bull, Tai Yi, Great Liang Dragon Sparrow, and Heart. The old man took the wine bowl that Su Fengnian handed over. He lowered his head and took a sip. Then, he looked at Wudong Mountain and said, "Wooden Bull was taken away by Li Chungang. It is broken. Fortunately, the Great Liang Dragon Sparrow that little Su took away is still intact and has an heir. The Su of Gojoseon's sword was originally my sword. Later on, I borrowed the hands of Lu Ding to give it to that child, Cui Hua. Only the ancient sword Heart did not recognize an owner. Until today, it is still stuck at the peak of the sword mountain." Not only did Su Fengnian, Dong Tai, and Chai Ching-shan, the sword Dao Grandmaster, even Lu Jijuan and Feng Zongxi heard the sound of a sword in the distance. It was obvious that there was definitely a peerless sword hidden in a box nearby. Moreover, it was trembling non-stop. Dong Tai's expression was cold and indifferent. The old man sighed and did not continue to persuade Dong Tai. Dong Tai put down the wine pot and said, Wuxia saved my life at the Sword Mountain. I have already repaid the debt by saving Su Fengnian's life at the Eastern Sea's martial emperor city. Wuxia imparted the Wu clan's sword arts to me. I have also given the 12 flying swords to Su Fengnian. We are even. The old man seemed to be a little tired. Whatever you say. I just feel sorry for the Tai sword. Isn't it also an abandoned child? Dong Tai finally raised his head and looked at the old man for the first time. When he was still a child, he lived alone on the Sword Mountain that was as silent as hell. Only when he was hungry would he go down the mountain to look for food. Otherwise, he would stay in the 10,000 sword forest and let the dense sword chi invade his body. He would faint and wake up again and again. That kind of pain was deep. It was bone deep. During those years, only 2 people climbed the Sword Mountain. Su Fengnian's mother, Wuxia, taught him the most basic sword arts in various ways. The other person was the old man in front of him. He once carried the unconscious youth to the top of the Sword Mountain and looked down at the Sword Mound. It was only until the day he left the Sword Mound that Dong Tai knew the identity of the strange old man. The sword hummed loudly. It was like a woman covering her mouth and sobbing non-stop. It was as if she was crying and complaining. It almost pierced the eardrums. Other than the old man, Su Fengnian, Dong Tai, and Chai Qingshan, even Qin Tianyuan, Qi Xianxia and Li Hozhong frowned. Feng Zongxi and Lu Jijuan circulated their qi continuously to resist the soul-stirring shapeless sword qi. Do Changfeng and the others covered their ears with all their might. On the other hand, the owner of the tea stall was an ordinary person. He only felt that the sound was a little noisy, but he was not hurt at all. The old man did not turn his head. He only pointed his finger in the direction of the carriage. In more than 30 years, that sword flew out of the Sword Mountain on its own 3 times. The first time was when you left the Wu family and it was forced to stay. The second time was when you went to the East Sea Martial Emperor City to challenge Wang Xianji. The third time was when you fought to the death with Tuoba in Beimang. In Great Peace City, when you fought with Su Fengnian, Chao Chongqing and the other 2, it did not leave the Sword Mound. It only wailed at the same place. It probably felt that its master would never be able to hold it in his hands in this lifetime. Since ancient times, all treasures that have been passed down have spirits. I believe that there are very few as pitiful as the Tai, a sword. Su Fengnian suddenly said self-deprecatingly, as one of the 4 great grandmasters of martial arts, when I returned to my peak after Chao Chongqing's death, Tuoba would not be able to advance any further. I thought that I was the closest to being the strongest in the world. The old man looked at Su Fengnian and Dong Tai. He laughed and said, in any case, it's the same. Dong Tai sighed heavily. Su Fengnian couldn't help but tease, old Deng, aren't you being pretentious? The old man nodded in agreement and said, yes. Dong Tai's expression was lonely. The old man stopped joking and said in a low voice, don't forget, your ancestor Dong Tai was one of the 9 people of the Wu family who defeated the cavalry of Beimang. He was also the person who controlled the sword formation. Dong Tai took a deep breath and looked at Su Fengnian. Outside the pass, to the north of Beimang City, give me 10,000 Beimang cavalry. Su Fengnian smiled and said, 10,000 is too little. 20,000 is too much. The old man jerked his lips and said to himself, as expected, he is the same as Su Shao. Dong Tai suddenly raised his arm. A white streak of light flew over. Dong Tai held the Tai, a sword. Sword energy filled the world. Chapter 1880. There was an irrigation ditch on the outskirts of Iha City in Yuzhou. In autumn, the reeds were covered in a vast expanse of snow. Several riverside villages were scattered among them. A carriage turned from the official road to a small road. The coachman was a young man in strange clothes with a dull expression. Behind the coachman sat a man in plain cotton-padded clothes. He leaned against the wall of the carriage with his legs dangling outside, gently swaying with the carriage. On the small road in the evening, the carriage caught up with an old farmer who had just finished his work. When the carriage passed by the old farmer, the man in cotton-padded clothes turned to look at the old man who was looking at him curiously. The old man had a very ugly face. Although he was hunched, he was still half a head taller than the old people in the south. His footsteps were also quite vigorous. It was obvious that the old man must have been a good fighter when he was young. The man in cotton-padded clothes softly called for Mr. The coachman pulled the reins and the carriage slowly stopped. The man jumped off the carriage and greeted with a smile, "Fourth Grandpa." The old farmer's face was full of astonishment. He did not know why this unfamiliar junior called him Fourth Grandpa. It was probably because he was intimidated by the cotton-clothed man's imposing manner that the old farmer stammered uneasily and did not dare to speak. The man in cotton-padded clothes smiled with the most authentic Yuzhou accent. "I am Chen Wang from the end of the village." "Fourth Grandpa, don't you recognize me?" The old farmer widened his eyes and looked at the young man who claimed to live at the end of the village. Then, he suddenly realized and a smile bloomed on his wrinkled face, "Little Wang." Chen Wang grinned and said, "Yes." The old man sighed and then wondered, "Why did you come back? Didn't you go to the capital to take the exam?" Chen Wang smiled and said, "I finished the exam long ago. This time, I went home to take a look. Fourth Grandpa lent me 2 taels of silver. I dare not forget." The old man waved his hand and asked curiously, "How did you do?" Chen Wang said softly, "Not bad." The old man said, "Oh." Perhaps he was afraid of hurting the young man's face, so he did not get to the bottom of it. Moreover, the old man who had been dealing with the yellow soil all his life could not get an answer. He just sighed, "What a pity." Chen Wang's expression was calm, as if he did not understand the regret in the old man's words. Chen Wang and the old farmer walked back to the village side by side. They talked about this year's harvest, the marriages of their peers, and whether the elders in the village were still alive. Through chatting, Chen Wang learned that his yellow mud house had long been dilapidated. One of the walls had collapsed. This was within reason. He hadn't returned to his hometown for 10 years. How could an extremely simple house be safe and sound? Chen Wang's parents had passed away one after another before he went to take the exam. An ownerless house was not like those weak reeds that would flourish in the spring even if they withered in the autumn. There were some things that the old farmer didn't say. In fact, after this young man came to the capital, there was a woman in the village who would often clean up. She kept the village as clean as her own home. Year after year, many of the young men who secretly admired her gave up and got married and had children. Gradually, the virgin girl became an old woman. But now that she was no longer here, what was the use of saying these things to Chen Wang? Moreover, Chen Wang had stayed in the capital for so many years. Perhaps he didn't remember her. Otherwise, if he really cared, why didn't he send a letter back even if he couldn't return home for so many years? When they were close to the entrance of the village, the old man raised his head to look at the village with smoke rising in spirals. He couldn't help but sigh. That girl's home was at the entrance of the village. What a virtuous child. Everyone within 100 li would give her a thumbs up. In the early years, the matchmaker almost broke the threshold of her home, but she didn't agree. Her parents couldn't do anything about it. No one expected that in the end, such a tragedy would happen. The common people all accepted their fate. If their fate was bad, they couldn't blame anyone. This was like getting an illness. If they could get through it, they could live. If they couldn't, then it was because the heavens didn't reward them with food. They could only be buried in peace. Chen Wang didn't enter the village. He suddenly stopped and asked, "Fourth grandfather, where is her grave?" The old man was stunned. He lowered his voice and said, "How do you know she?" The old man didn't continue speaking. Chen Wang also didn't speak. The old man pointed in the direction of the ferry and said, "Over there. The grave mound is small, but easy to find." Chen Wang took out a heavy money pouch and a letter. "Fourth grandfather, please help me pay off the village's debt. Give it to Li Jing or the teacher from the nearby private school. It's written clearly on there." The old man hesitated but didn't refuse in the end. He carefully took the letter and money pouch and asked, "Are you not going back to the village to take a look?" Chen Wang shook his head and said, "I won't go. After visiting my parents' graves, I need to immediately return to Jing." The old man sighed emotionally. "You're in too much of a rush." Chen Wang smiled. The old man had just walked a few steps when he suddenly turned back and asked, "Little Wang, you're really a high-ranking official in Jing?" Chen Wang didn't seem to know how to answer. "A high-ranking official in Great Peace City. High-ranking official Huang Zi, in the center of power, a ruler of a dynasty." So he could only smile and say, "It's not that big." The old man said with relief, "Then it's very good. Fourth grandfather knew a long time ago that you wouldn't be bad." Chen Wang's smile was light. The old man didn't forget to glance at the young person standing next to Chen Wang. When he turned and left, he was full of suspicion. That person's clothing was very strange. Chen Wang and the young eunuch of the same age as the country slowly walked forward. His parents' graves were not far from the village. Chen Wang raised his hand and brushed the reeds. When he had studied hard, he didn't even dare to think about becoming a grand scholar or getting a place in the imperial exam. His parents didn't have such hopes. They only felt that their son being able to read and write was a good thing to bring glory to their family. Beiliang was very cold. It was very good if each family could produce a scholar. It was very different from the Central Plains, especially the rich Jiangnan. That place was very particular about passing down the family through farming and studying. In Beiliang, it was common for young people to join the army, but it was rare to find someone with a book in their hands. When he had just entered the capital to participate in the imperial examination, Beiliang was the only one that had not set up an examination hall in Great Peace City. He was unfamiliar with the place and did not have the care of the seniors from his hometown in the imperial examination. He could only stay in a small temple. Beiliang's accent caused him to run into resistance everywhere. The same ancient book was sold to him at a much higher price. Even after he had participated in the court examination, he still did not have any friendships in his generation. Beiliang was the only one. Jean Lanting's meteoric rise in Great Peace City and Yan Jiexi's rise to become a relative of the imperial family were due to personal grievances and did not change this. Even though Yao Baifeng was the left chancellor of the imperial college, he did not have the ability to change this. And he, Chen Wang, the Qin Shaobao in the eyes of all the civil and military officials, was the left scattered cavalry of the province, and the future grand secretary that the emperor relied on the most. He had the heart and the power, but he could not do it. Chen Wang walked slowly. On his two sides were reeds that were taller than a person's head. The large and soft reed flowers were blown up by the autumn wind and landed somewhere unknown. Chen Wang arrived at the grave mound and pulled out the messy weeds. Then, he straightened his clothes and knelt down to kowtow 3 times. The son wanted to take care of his parents, but the parents did not wait. The old man that this cotton-clothed man respectfully called fourth great-grandfather probably did not know in his life that the 2 items that the junior had handed to him, the money pouch and the letter, were worth thousands of gold just from the 2 words, Chen Wang, at the end. In the 20 years of Beiliang's history, there were only a few people in the Liang officialdom. Among them, Jean Lanting was the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights, Yan Jieshi was a scholar, and the Confucian scholar Yao Baifeng was in charge of the Imperial College. However, even if the 3 of them were added together, they might not be as important as Chen Wang. It could even be said that in a large sense, It was this scholar from Beiliang who had left his hometown. His 2 secret letters changed the structure of Beiliang. On the way back, Chen Wang met a sturdy man of the same age. After seeing him, the man's expression was complicated. There was resentment, reverence, surprise, and confusion. The man took a deep breath and handed Chen Wang a coarse cloth bag with a straight face. "These are the things my sister left behind. They are the books you left behind. I'm returning them to you." Chen Wang took the cloth bag and was lost in thought. The man turned around and strode away. He stopped and said with a hoarse voice, "Wang, although my sister. Don't think that she died in a dubious way. She's cleaner than anyone else." Chen Wang covered his mouth and looked at the back of the man who used to put his arm around his shoulder and call him brother-in-law. He said vaguely, "I'm sorry." The man muttered, "You can say that to her." Chen Wang was silent. Blood seeped out between his fingers. He did not move for a long time. Chen Wang carried the cloth bag to the ferry and found the small grave. The eunuch was nowhere to be found. Chen Wang sat cross-legged in front of the grave. He sat across from the small grave. There was an illiterate woman who would find a clean place under the sun to dry her books. She would open them one by one and put them away one by one. There was an unmarried woman who would go to the small ferry when no one was around. She would look into the distance again and again and turn around again and again. Chen Wang gently opened the cloth bag and looked down. There were familiar books such as The Book of Rites and The Great Learning. There were also older books such as 3,000 Books of Elementary Learning. Back then, when they were working in the fields, washing clothes at the ferry, picking reeds during the heavy snow, he would often recite to her. 10 years had passed between this year and that year. He and she were separated by yin and yang. Chen Wang closed his eyes and read softly, "The country is in trouble. The king dies in the country. The doctor dies in the ancestral temple. The people die in the countryside." The gentleman said, "Great virtue is not an official, great Tao is not a tool. Great faith is not agreed, and great time is not uniform. Those who observe these 4 can aspire to learn. Let the people of the world be united in worship and worship. As if on top of it, as if on the left and right of it." In the twilight, the scholar was reading. The reeds swayed gently in the wind. It was like a woman nodding her head and smiling like a flower. Chapter 1881. The 3 riders and 1 donkey circled around Fuxia town and came to the memorial arch at the foot of Mount Wudong. Su Fengnian, Fan Shaochai, and Chen Tianyuan dismounted together. Dong Tai patted the old donkey's back after landing and started chanting. Chen Tianyuan looked up at the words Wudong Dang Xing, written by ancestor Lu himself. He did not look like an ordinary swordsman but was full of spirit and fighting spirit. Su Fengnian suddenly turned to Fan Shaochai and said, "Go to the southeast of Liang. If you can find that guy in 2 years, help me pass a message to him. Tell him that he has to pay back the money he owed me." Fan Shaochai frowned and said, "According to the spies of Fu Shui room, the villages and towns there are scattered all over the place. It's not easy to find him with the scattered clues from before." Su Fengnian nodded and said, "Finding a needle in a haystack depends on fate. Just think of it as doing your best. I don't expect you to find that guy." Fan Shaochai asked with a straight face, "Can you change the spy? I'm good at killing and only killing. There are many people in Fu Shui room who are more suitable for finding people." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "No." There was a hint of anger in Fan Shaochai's eyes. It swayed like water plants in her limpid eyes. She was angry but did not dare to say anything. Su Fengnian teased, "Maybe in less than 2 years, you'll hear the news of my death. Won't that save you a lot of trouble?" Fan Shaochai said stiffly, "The happiest thing in the world is cutting off the head of one's enemy with one's own hands." Su Fingnian sighed and said helplessly, "You only dare to show your true feelings in front of me. If Lu Qiu was here, would you have the courage?" Fan Shaochai smiled sweetly and asked, "Is Chu Lushan here?" Su Fingnian said unhappily, "That's why I said that evil people can only be dealt with by evil people." Fan Shaochai took a deep look at the young lord and mounted his horse again. After a moment of hesitation, he reached for the hilt of the saber at his waist. "This pawn of crossing the river." Su Fingnian smiled and said, "It's just a temporary loan. You still have to return it." Fan Shaochai sped away on his horse. Chen Tianyuan had been immersed in the magnificent sword intent of Ancestor Lu's 4 words. He was awakened by the sound of horse hooves gradually fading away. He asked doubtfully, "Why did she leave?" Su Fingnian said indifferently, "I sent her to the Central Plains to do something." "Oh," Chen Tianyuan replied. He waited until the woman and her horse had completely disappeared from his sight before he mounted his horse and looked in the direction of her disappearing figure. His heroic spirit overflowed as he laughed heartily. "May the world know of my sword, there are only 3, Qing Shan, Qing Shui, and Fan Shaochai." Su Fingnian sneered, "If you have the ability, say that to her yourself." After Chen Tianyuan mounted the horse, he slightly straightened the famed sword at his waist. "Why should I say such annoying words?" Su Fingnian said, "But you're half-master and I don't like to hear them either." After Chen Tianyuan covered his face with the raw skin, he spat out, "What does it have to do with me?" and galloped away. Dong Tai smiled. "I'm fine with it." Su Fingnian rolled his eyes. "I really can't stand this young banished immortal's temper." Dong Tai sighed with emotion for no reason. Perhaps when Li Chungang first came out, he was also this annoying. As far as I know, the heroines and fairies of Jianghu just happened to fall for this. Su Fingnian grimaced and said resentfully, "That can't be, right?" Dong Tai dismissed it with a laugh. Su Fingnian sighed heavily and muttered, "Right now. I'm a little depressed." Dong Tai asked, "Are you waiting for someone?" Su Fingnian sighed and said, "Although Song Nianqing once tried to kill me with the 14 new swords, it didn't stop me from having a good impression of the Donghua sword pool. As for Chai Qingshan, who took over the sword pool, it can be said that an exchange of blows leads to friendship. There are people in Jianghu who can't be hated, whether they're friends or foes. Chai Qingshan Wang Mingyin outside Xiangfan City is the same, and Cat Man Han Xingxian outside Shenhui City is the same." Dong Tai was silent. The ancestor of the Wu family sword tomb, who had a deep relationship with him and the young king, returned to the Central Plains after delivering the swords. It seemed that he had completely retired from Jianghu. Dong Tai seemed to realize something and asked curiously, "Why did you let that woman leave Beiliang at this time? Did you hope that she could take Chen Tianyuan to the Central Plains?" Su Fingnian smiled and said, "The main thing was to find her, and at the same time take away that eyesore banished immortal, killing 2 birds with 1 stone." The young king held the hilt of his sword and stood under the archway. The breeze brushed his face, making him look like an immortal. The peach blossom sword deity stood side by side with him and looked into the distance with a sword hanging from his waist. He was the number 1 sword deity in the world. Su Fingnian asked softly, "The old man with the sheep fur coat, old monster Wang, and Chao Chongqing, they all left their fates in the human world. Old Wang also left a sword manual for me. Dong Tai, what about you?" The peach blossom sword deity, who entered Taoism through swordsmanship and stood shoulder to shoulder with Ancestor Lu and Li Chungang at the top of the sword forest, said calmly, "I, Dong Tai, don't want to die." Su Fingnian said enviously, "You're so cool." Dong Tai saw Chai Qingshan and the others coming slowly from afar. Obviously, he had no intention of accompanying Su Fingnian. He turned around and led the donkey up the mountain. Chai Qingshan and Qi Xianqiu walked together. The divine fist of the Central Plains, Feng Zongxi, and the fairies of the Piamiao Peak also joined in the fun. However, the Snow Hut Spear Saintly Zhongho and his disciples did not appear. Su Fengnian's left shoulder was suddenly patted heavily. He turned around and saw no one. He turned to the other side and still saw no one. Su Fengnian pretended to be surprised. Soon, a little girl who was squatting on the ground jumped up and laughed. "Are you scared?" Su Fengnian squinted his eyes and smiled. The corners of his mouth curled up and his smile was especially gentle. Every time he saw her, from the first meeting to the second meeting, he only felt happy. Su Fengnian stretched out his hand and rubbed her hair. "Oh, you've grown taller." She put her hands on her hips and raised her chin high. She puffed out her chest and did not hide her pride. Su Fengnian smiled and asked, "Where are the little monks Nanbei and Nanbei?" She rolled her eyes and said, "Stupid Nanbei. He's talking to a little Daoist boy called Yufu. I don't want to play with them. You don't know. A little bald head and a little scholar. When these two are together, they like to talk to each other. It's even more boring than when those big old bald heads at home gather together to talk about scriptures and quarrel." "Then what about your parents?" "I'm so worried. Not long ago, there was a female pilgrim from Jiangnan on the mountain. I don't know how she recognized my father. She cried so hard. My mother was so angry that smoke was coming out of her 7 orifices. My father took the initiative to wash his clothes for several days, but it was no use. Yesterday, he even borrowed some copper coins from the old Daoist of Wudang Mountain, saying that he would let my mother go down the mountain to buy some rouge and face powder. And your mother didn't agree. How could that be? It's not like you don't know that my mother will compete with anyone, but not with rouge and face powder. When she got the money, she went down the mountain to the town at the foot of the mountain. When she returned to the mountain, she fiddled with her clothes for almost 2 hours before she was willing to see anyone. Was your father scared?" "Nonsense. My father kept saying that my mother was as beautiful as a fairy. Unfortunately, when my mother finally calmed down, the female pilgrim used the excuse of leaving to find my parents. After seeing my mother's makeup, the woman didn't say anything. She just glanced at my mother from the corner of her eyes, and then the corners of her mouth curled up. In the end, she ignored my mother and only cared about politely greeting my father. When she left, I saw her quite clearly. She secretly curled her lips at my mother. In this way, there was no and then. Lizzie, your mother has met her match." I didn't think so at the time, but now that I think about it, it really was quite hurtful. Actually, it's my fault. When my mother was fiercely applying rouge and face powder, I didn't pay much attention. Otherwise, my mother would definitely look better. It's fine. As long as your father thinks your mother looks good, it's fine. That's true, but he has a disciple called Nanbei. At that time, my father really had no other choice, so he asked, "Nanbei, do you also think that your master's wife is the most beautiful woman in the world?" Guess what? Nanbei replied, "Master, you said that monks don't lie." After that, my mother pulled my father's ear, and my father pulled Nanbei's ear. These 3 are really too much. They're like children who can't grow up. It makes me very worried. Su Fengnian, why don't you take me to Mount Qingliang to play? Liangzhou City's meat buns are delicious, but they're a bit expensive. Su Fengnian didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he looked at the girl with her head tilted. He didn't want to disappoint her, so he bent his finger and lightly tapped her forehead. "You can go to Mount Qingliang to play, but you have to get your parents' permission." She nodded her head like a chick pecking at rice. Then, she tugged on Su Fengnian's sleeve and said in a low voice, "When you get to the mountain, see my father. Remember, if you see my father turn around and go back to his room, immediately run away." Su Fengnian was confused. The girl said embarrassedly, "These past few years, my father has liked to sharpen his knife when he has nothing to do." Su Fengnian was speechless. Chapter 1882. At this time, Chai Qingshan and his party were approaching the archway. Chai Qingshan was standing under the steps. The old man nodded to greet him. Feng Zongxi and Lu Jijuan, the two famous Jianghu bigwigs, were actually rising stars, compared to Chai Qingshan, a martial arts grandmaster who was truly famous in the imperial court. At this time, the two of them respectfully cupped their fists and saluted to the young lord, loudly announcing their names. Su Fengnian stretched out his hand and said with a chuckle, "This king is only a pilgrim of Wudong Mountain today. You don't have to be so polite." The Li Thing secretly made a face. Su Fengnian smiled. She coughed lightly and winked at him. Su Fengnian held back his laughter and said seriously, "Let me introduce you. This is Miss Li. She is the most chivalrous and righteous. She is also good at martial arts. People call her." Su Fengnian paused for a moment and quickly turned his head to look at her and winked at her. Back then, when they were roaming Jianghu together, one of their favorite things was to give themselves nicknames. At that time, except for Huang, the other three fledgling Jianghu birds were all short-sighted. The only nicknames they could come up with were probably Feng Zongxi's Divine Fist of the Central Plains. They could come up with anything to scare people, and the bolder it sounded, the better. That year, Miss Li Zi, who ran away from home, gave herself no less than 20 nicknames. She even lectured Su Fengnian and the guy with the wooden sword. We Wulin heroes can only give wrong names, but not wrong nicknames. Therefore, people in Jianghu must be very careful when dealing with nicknames. After Su Fengnian read her lips clearly, he continued without leaving a trace, "Jianghu people call you Fairy Tongxian. It's only because Miss Li is proficient in all of the sabers, swords, spears, and staffs that you're proficient in, that you're able to form your own sect." The girl didn't care about the posture of a heroine and hurriedly reminded, "My Qing Gong, don't forget to tell me about it." Su Fengnian could only obediently fill in the gaps and said, "Fairy Li's Qing Gong is also very good. It can be said that you are unparalleled in Jianghu." Feng Zongxi and Lu Jijuan, who were experienced in Jianghu, had sharp eyes. Although they didn't know what the young king was singing, they still did a full set of Jianghu etiquette with the girl. After a full set of etiquette, she, who was addicted to being a heroine, was so happy that she couldn't close her mouth. Suddenly, she whispered, "Su Fengnian, do you still remember our agreement?" Su Fengnian smiled and nodded. "Living, if you can lie, never stand. Jianghu, if you can fly, you." She patted Su Fengnian's shoulder rudely. "This king will go first, this king will Jianghu, to everyone. To go Jianghu head." Then, he crouched down and carried her on his back. His figure flew up like a rainbow. The two of them arrived at the top of Big Lotus Peak. Su Fengnian still carried the heroine on his back, just like when she was tired and wanted him to carry her. She leaned on his back and whispered, "Su Fengnian, you have always treated me as a sister, right?" Su Fengnian nodded. She suddenly smiled, "It's okay." Su Fengnian turned his head slightly and said with a bitter face, "You hurt my feelings." She bumped her forehead against his. Su Fengnian turned his head again, full of smiles. She hugged his neck and carefully asked, "Su Fengnian, if I take stupid Nanbei and leave Beiliang, will you be angry?" Su Fengnian shook his head, "Of course not. You are a heroine who roams Jianghu. Nanbei is a monk who chants Buddhist scriptures. Why should you get involved?" She sniffled. Su Fengnian comforted her, "I will definitely find you in the future." She didn't say anything. Between the mountains and rivers, the girl's thoughts were better than all the poems. Near the girl's house was a hastily built thatched cottage. A white-robed monk who was originally sitting on a stool in front of the house sighed. When he saw this scene, the middle-aged monk who was washing his wife's clothes did not bother with the washboard. He suddenly stood up and strode towards the simple thatched cottage. Li Donghai quickly jumped off his back and shouted at Su Fingnian, "The situation is tense. Let's go." Su Fingnian didn't say anything and immediately ran away. The white-robed monk quickly rushed out of the house with a kitchen knife in hand. He looked around with a murderous look. This murderous look was probably not inferior to Dong Tai's Taiya sword at the foot of the mountain. One must know that in the past, Chao Chengqing's heavenly image state was the most outstanding, Dong Tai's finger mystery sword was the most powerful, and finally, Li Dongxin's Vajra state of the two Zen temples was the most invincible. Li Dongxin's aura was like a Buddha lying down, sitting, and standing. There were only two people in the world who weren't afraid of Li Dongxin. His wife and daughter. The girl happened to be one of them, so she didn't care about her father. She put her hands behind her back, hummed a tune, and leisurely strolled elsewhere. This daughter who didn't know how to love her father. The white-robed monk sighed heavily, put down the kitchen knife, sat back on the stool, and continued to wash clothes. When the little monk Nanbei returned to the thatched cottage, he heard his master talking to himself. The little monk moved a stool and sat down, asking, "Master, are you reciting scriptures?" "You can say that, it's just a little difficult. Every household, temple has its own difficult scriptures." "Master, but the old abbot said that scriptures are the easiest to recite in the world." "That's why the abbot is the abbot. You can only be the disciple of the abbot's disciple." "Sigh, Master, what if I can't find a disciple in the future? If our temple wasn't sealed off, it would be simple. Find a dark and windy day, Master will bring you a big sack and catch a little bald head. Now, it's difficult. Master, my disciple is far worse than the old abbot's disciple." "Master, just say that I'm not as good as you." "That won't do, how can there be such a shameless master?" "Master, today, Yu Fu helped someone read their fortune and wrote a letter to their family. The two elders insisted on giving Yu Fu money. Yu Fu couldn't refuse them no matter how hard he tried. Yu Fu knew that us master and disciple need to spend money frequently, so he gave the money to disciple. Disciple will return the money to him now. Nanbei, Master is actually very proud to have a disciple like you. Master, I'll definitely give this money to Master's wife." "Oh right, where is Master's wife?" "Your Master's wife, sleeping." Everyone loves to sleep, but there are very few people who understand the samadhi. Otherwise, why would the ancients say sleeping together is the most virtuous? Your Master's wife is even better than Master. Master. I only know that Master's wife's snoring is very powerful. Master can sleep better than anyone else, you're even more powerful. Oh. Stupid Nanbei, you've improved. Ha. The two bald heads, one big and one small, touched their bald heads almost at the same time. The white-robed monk touched his head and looked into the distance. He said softly, "The black hair on your Master's wife's head is the temple in Master's heart. The wrinkles at the corner of her eyes are the scriptures that Master never gets tired of looking at. Her snoring is the Dharma that Master never gets tired of hearing." The little monk was dumbfounded. He didn't know why his master suddenly became so poetic. Then, he heard his master's wife snort softly behind them. She laughed and scolded, "Damn it." The little monk turned his head and glanced at his master's wife who was walking back into the house. He then looked at his master's serene face and sighed, "Master." The white-robed monk didn't look back. He lowered his head and washed his clothes. He said softly, "Your master's wife thinks that she doesn't look good with rouge. She just wants to hear Master say that she looks good. But she doesn't know that in Master's eyes, she's always so beautiful." The little monk stammered, Master's wife has already gone far." The white-robed monk murmured, "Is peace and quiet far away?" "Not far. Is the city far away? Not far. Is life and death far away? Not far. Then master's wife and master will naturally be very close. The little monk was confused. He said with heartfelt admiration, "Master, you really have the root of wisdom." The white-robed monk tipped a chestnut on his stupid disciple's bald head. "You're asking for a beating. How can a disciple praise his master for having the root of wisdom?" The little monk looked innocent. The middle-aged monk with his back to the cottage lowered his voice. "Has your master's wife really gone far?" The little monk turned his head and looked back in an instant. Obviously, he was already very familiar with this action. He nodded and said in a deep voice, "Master's wife has closed the door." The middle-aged monk said, "Oh." The little monk sighed and moved the bucket and washboard. The white-robed monk smiled and praised, "Disciple, you also have the root of wisdom." The little monk didn't say anything. The white-robed monk folded his hands on his knees and leaned back a little. He looked up at the sky. This poor monk has comprehended all the scriptures and dharma in the world. This poor monk has seen all the beautiful scenes in the world. Only that face that is often covered with thick rouge can never be enough. The white-robed monk smiled and touched his head. "You've become a Buddha." Chapter 1883. If one stood at the top of the big lotus peak and looked down, the two mountain paths in the north and south were like two dragons lying majestically on Mount Wudong. As a famous scenic spot on Mount Wudong, the elephant pool was even more crowded. Family members and visitors lingered here, forgetting to go home. There was a Jianghu man with a loud voice standing on the bluestone beside the pool, talking loudly about the various wonders and anecdotes of the elephant pool. He said that the Wudong senior sword maniac Wang Xiaoping had once secluded himself to comprehend the sword here, which led to the soul-stirring battle with Wang Xinji of the martial emperor city. He also said that the current Prince Liang had practiced his blade here for many years. Before he left the mountain, he was able to force the waterfall to reverse its flow with one strike, which was so powerful that it could reach as far as 10 miles away. The young men and women who listened were all swayed. They were still inexperienced but still looked forward to the young heroes of Jianghu. Everyone was overwhelmed with emotion, as if they had personally witnessed the peerless demeanor of the young martial arts master. There was a pavilion near the elephant pool. Between the elephant pool and the pavilion, there were many stalls selling incense and candles, fortune-telling for people, and all kinds of clever items. There were even hawkers who cooked on the spot, selling Wudong sesame seed cakes, Taoist stir-fried vegetables, calming soup, and so on. A young man with a bucket on his shoulder stood dumbfounded outside the dense crowd. If he wanted to carry 2 buckets of water, wouldn't he have to fight his way out? He could only follow a deep bluestone path back to the cottage where the mistress was temporarily missing. He put down his shoulder and bucket, took a gourd ladle and bent down to scoop up a ladle of water from the bottom of the water tank. He slowly walked to the vegetable garden and leisurely watered it. After autumn, the greenery of the vegetable garden was not as rich as in spring and summer. It looked a little lonely. He finally squatted at the edge of the vegetable garden with the gourd ladle and wandered thousands of miles. The peach blossom sword deity stood up and walked toward the hut after sensing a familiar aura. He saw Dong Tai, who was leading the donkey, standing outside the short bamboo fence. The peach blossom sword deity didn't push the donkey away until he saw its owner. He fastened the reins and sat down on the small bamboo chair the young man brought over, his buttocks cold. Because Su Fingnian was carrying Li Ti on his back, he was able to reach the summit earlier than Dong Tai. "Have you been to LV Zuding?" he asked with a smile. Dong Tai nodded. "If it wasn't for that tablet, I wouldn't have recognized it." Su Fingnian asked again, "How's the calligraphy?" Dong Tai said indifferently, "Boring." Su Fingnian said with a clear conscience, "When I left the mountain, I wasn't even in the first rank. It's normal for me to be lacking in spirit." It turned out that the simple LV Zuding was built 700 years ago. According to the records of the county, before the young LV Zuding made Mount Wudong a place of cultivation, he climbed the mountain alone with a sword. When he was halfway up the mountain, he looked into the distance. An old man holding a walking stick appeared and asked LV Zuding, who was not famous at the time, about the way of immortality. LV Zuding gave him a prophecy and helped him to attain immortality. In the end, there was a poem that spread widely. It was said that it was written by LV Zuding. Walking alone, sitting alone, I don't know the world. Only the old locust spirit knows that the immortals have passed. The poem was carved on an ancient tablet by the Wudong Taoists, but the writing was eroded by time. Before Su Fengnian went down the mountain to practice his saber, a young martial granduncle riding a bull was pushed out by his senior brother. He asked Su Fengnian for the tablet inscription that was changed to cursive. Dong Tai looked around, happy and content. Su Fengnian joked, "There are so many martial arts masters on Mount Wudong now. Just in Nanjiang, there's the master saber master Mao Shulang, Qing Baishuang, who's trying to become the scholarly sage, Ji Luhen, and Wei Miao and Xue Songwan and Xu and Zhao." Dong Tai's words were shocking. "When I was climbing the mountain just now, I saw Gu Jiantang, and then I saw Xianyuan Qingfeng in the LV Zuding." Su Fengnian frowned. "It's not strange that I didn't notice Gu Jiantang climbing the mountain, but Xianyuan Qingfeng was close at hand." Dong Tai hit the nail on the head. During the battle outside Great Peace City, Chao Chongqing seemed to favor this woman who blocked the way. Xianyuan Qingfeng benefited greatly from this, and now he's only a step away. Su Fengnian sighed. "So that's how it is. The opportunities of this woman in charge of the Great Snow Plains can't be explained with common sense." Lu Songtao, Xiao Huangchao, Wang Xianji, and Chao Chongqing, they either taught her everything or enlightened her. In the end, she became one of the few masters in the world. Dong Tai said with a bit of sarcasm, "You missed out on the most important person, didn't you?" Su Fengnian's face was immediately filled with embarrassment. Dong Tai suddenly asked, "Do you need me to help you block Gu Jiantang, whose intentions are unclear?" Su Fengnian only felt confused. He didn't know why this aloof peach blossom sword god would suddenly be so kind. After all, Wang Xianji had already come to a conclusion about Dong Tai's character. The general idea was that Dong Tai was extremely passionate about the sword, and was the most emotionless. Therefore, he was the most compatible with the way of the heavens. Moreover, Gu Jiantang, who was on the cusp of the Liang imperial court, left his territory without permission and chose to travel incognito to Mount Wudong. It could be said that he had entered the hinterland of Beiliang alone. It was obvious that he wouldn't cause any trouble on Mount Wudong. Even if Su Fengnian wasn't at the peak of his realm, he still had a high chance of winning against Gu Jiantang, who had been hiding his strength for many years. Just as Su Fengnian was puzzled, Dong Tai coughed softly and disappeared in an instant. Su Fengnian subconsciously looked towards the purple bamboo fence and found that even the old donkey had disappeared. With an ashen face, Su Fengnian turned his head stiffly and looked over. Sure enough, in the garden at the northeast corner of the thatched cottage, some of the greenery that had been growing well had been eaten away. It was like a landscape painting by a famous master that had been dug out by an ignorant child. Previously, a white-robed monk had turned around and walked into the cottage with a kitchen knife. Su Fengnian did the same. Gnashing his teeth, he ran back to the thatched cottage and quickly took down the cold knife hanging on the wall. After leaving the cottage, he angrily said, "Dong Tai, if you have the guts, don't run. I'll treat you to donkey roasted meat tonight." As a martial arts evaluation grandmaster, Dong Tai deliberately concealed his aura. Even Su Fengnian couldn't find any clues. Su Fengnian squatted on the ground and sighed. It was really a Motherf *Ker disaster. Sometimes, when God punched you, he didn't give you a date to eat, but another punch to the head. When Su Fengnian caught a glimpse of a dress from the corner of his eye, he felt as if he was struck by lightning. When it rains, it pours. Su Fengnian was worthy of being called a king with a different surname and a great pillar of the country. He made a prompt decision. Regardless of whether he could hide for the first time or not, if he could hide for one more day, he would live for one more day. Therefore, when Su Fengnian was about to leave, Jiang Ni's voice filled with grief and indignation came from behind. Surnamed Su. You're dead today.